Muito bom dia a todas e a todos. É um prazer iniciar esse nosso segundo dia desse seminário internacional, o Diálogo Global de Proteção de Dados Pessoais, que é uma parceria entre o CEDIS-IDP e o CIPL. Então, bom dia a todos que nos escutam, bom dia a todos os palestrantes, Giovana, Marcos Heider, Isabela Rosal e todos nós que nos acompanham aqui. Nós tivemos um dia intenso ontem, discutimos temas centrais para a LGPD, em especial para a efetividade, para a implementação da Lei Geral de Proteção de Dados. Tivemos, então, a discussão sobre a própria ANPD, sobre regulação responsiva, sobre regulação inteligente e também sobre accountability. E eu queria falar aqui um pouco como é importante para o Brasil, nesse momento em que a ANPD está se constituindo, como é importante pensar em uma modelagem regulatória contemporânea, moderna. Porque, afinal, se a ANPD acaba de ser constituída no ano passado, nós temos uma grande oportunidade de que ela já se adapte, né, por assim dizer, a um modelo regulatório, eu diria que hoje é buscado no Brasil por grande parte das agências reguladoras, que é o que a gente chama de regulação por incentivos ou mesmo regulação responsiva. Então, me parece que esse modelo que supera um modelo unicamente pautado em comando e controle, unicamente pautado em regras muito detalhadas e sanções, me parece que é um modelo que a própria LGPD, né, e como a gente viu também nas discussões ontem, que a própria LGPD já traz como uma grande oportunidade para o Brasil e eu diria que ela traz quase como as sementes para que a gente pudesse desenvolver, para que a gente possa desenvolver esse modelo no Brasil. Então, me parece que é fundamental aproveitar essa oportunidade e constituir esse modelo. Lembrando, se a gente for pensar aqui um pouco no conceito de regulação responsiva, ele é um modelo muito mais pautado no diálogo, e aqui no diálogo tanto com os regulados, tanto com controladores e operadores, como também com a sociedade civil. Se a gente for pensar aqui na teoria do Braithwaite, que é uma delas sobre regulação responsiva, a gente vai pegar o conceito de tripartismo. Então, é a ideia de que a regulação ela é muito mais efetiva, por um lado, muito mais eficiente, e também mais legítima se ela dialogar com os atores. E aqui, seja com os titulares, representados, né, pelas entidades civis, seja também com os próprios atores, com os regulados, de uma forma geral, controladores e operadores de dados. Então, esse é um ponto muito importante. E um outro ponto muito importante que também a teoria da regulação responsiva nos traz é a ideia de governança nodal. E isso nós vamos discutir também, e aqui já pensando aqui um pouco na continuidade do nosso evento, porque amanhã vamos discutir, teremos um evento fechado para convidados, para discutirmos exclusivamente tanto policy, né, tanto políticas e, eu diria, interação intergovernamental, esse complexo arranjo institucional no Brasil, como também a visão da indústria e como efetivar a LGPD pela indústria, pelos controladores. Então, aqui me parece que um outro ponto importante da regulação responsiva é a ideia de governança nodal, a ideia de que os atores governamentais podem se somar, podem se complementar e precisam se coordenar na implementação de determinadas políticas. E aqui não é diferente. Então, me parece que as lições que a gente extrai de ontem do nosso seminário podem ser, de forma muito úteis e muito importantes, utilizadas nesse momento inicial de constituição, eu diria, de toda a política de proteção de dados no Brasil. Então, essas seriam um pouco as palavras iniciais. Eu já queria, então, passar para a Giovana para falar um pouco da nossa programação de hoje. Giovana, você tem a palavra.
Obrigada, Laura, e boas-vindas a todos que entraram agora. Para quem entrou agora e perdeu aí um pouquinho da fala inicial da Laura, esse é o segundo dia do nosso evento, o Seminário Internacional Diálogo Global. Quem perdeu ontem, o primeiro dia, foi gravado e está sendo gravado hoje, e a gente vai disponibilizar. Enfim, eu queria dar as boas-vindas e agradecer a todos os nossos panelistas que entraram ontem e hoje, que vão participar das discussões de amanhã também. Para a informação de todos, nós temos todos os diretores da NPD confirmados no nosso evento. A diretora Nairone vai falar na mesa redonda de amanhã. Nós temos autoridades de proteção de dados do mundo inteiro e representantes do governo também entrando e discutindo esses temas com a gente. E também representantes de grandes empresas que são reconhecidas publicamente como empresas que são accountable, que são responsáveis na área de proteção de dados e que podem trazer para vocês exemplos de boas práticas nos diversos temas que nós estamos discutindo. Ontem as discussões focaram em accountability, em regulação responsiva, como a Laura falou. Hoje a gente vai falar um pouquinho de transferência internacional de dados e de incidentes de segurança e vazamento de dados. E amanhã, como a Laura falou, a gente vai ter duas mesas redondas, uma de política focada para política pública, que vai focar em coordenação entre diversos reguladores, e a segunda vai ser uma mesa mais aberta para a indústria, e como a Laura disse, essas mesas são para convidados. Eu queria só falar para vocês aqui que todos esses assuntos que a gente está tratando no seminário, em geral, os assuntos de privacidade e proteção de dados, eles são interligados. Então, ou seja, não é porque ontem nós falamos de regulação efetiva e responsiva e accountability que hoje os assuntos vão ser diferentes e completamente independentes. Na verdade, quando você pensa nesses assuntos, por exemplo, se você tomar o tema de transferência internacional de dados de hoje, para esse tema ter sucesso, ou seja, para possibilitarmos que exista confiança no sistema de transferência internacional de dados, que essas transferências sejam possibilitadas de uma forma responsável, é preciso que nós tenhamos reguladores que são colaborativos, que são efetivos e que são inovadores para possibilitar essas transferências. Da mesma forma que, para que empresas consigam administrar e prevenir o vazamento de dados e incidentes de segurança, eles também precisam ter regras e procedimentos internos que sejam efetivos, ou seja, eles precisam também seguir aí práticas de accountability. Ontem a Boiana mostrou o Accountability Framework do CIPL, que é composto de diversos elementos, 7 elementos, um deles sendo procedimentos e políticas internas. Então, todos esses assuntos de privacidade e proteção de dados, eles se interligam. Eu acho que esse é um dos principais takeaways, não sei falar isso em português, peço perdão, que a gente vai tirar desse evento em geral. Ontem as discussões foram incríveis, hoje também podemos aguardar outras discussões incríveis. Temos 2 keynotes, um do Trevor, que vai ser o próximo a falar, e o James Nook do DCMS. E, bom, queria agradecer e também terminar aqui a minha fala de resultados iniciais, de que tanto o CEDIS do IDP, representado aqui pela Laura e pelo Danilo, que também participa do nosso projeto, e Isabela, que está por trás de toda a coordenação com a gente, quanto o CIPL, nós respondemos separadamente às consultas públicas da NPD, inclusive a consulta pública. Laura, você está tentando falar alguma coisa, mas você está no mudo. Desculpa, nós respondemos às consultas públicas da NPD, inclusive de incidentes de segurança. Que vai moderar o painel 4, que vai ser o segundo painel de hoje, ela vai falar um pouquinho sobre isso. E o CIPL publica e trabalha internacionalmente com empresas, reguladores, com governos, representantes do setor público e privado, em todos esses assuntos, e todos os nossos materiais são publicados no nosso site. Nós temos diversos papers publicados em todos os temas que estão sendo tratados nesse seminário e em outros temas também. Então, eu recomendo verificar. E com isso, eu queria passar a palavra para o Trevor Hughes, que é presidente e CEO da IIPP, que é a principal associação de profissionais na nossa área de proteção de dados e privacidade. Trevor, obrigada por aceitar esse convite para esse keynote, e eu acho que vai ser ótimo ter você falando um pouquinho agora sobre esse papel das pessoas que trabalham em privacidade, dos Data Protection Officers, e também da importância da profissão dos profissionais de privacidade e proteção de dados, e só queria reforçar que isso é muito relevante, principalmente para o Brasil agora. Nós estamos vendo um boom incrível no Brasil de novos profissionais de privacidade, de organizações que estão treinando e capacitando essas pessoas no Brasil. E eu, trabalhando num aspecto global, eu consigo ver a diferença que é a comunidade de privacidade do Brasil para a comunidade de privacidade internacional, o nível de engajamento dos brasileiros nessa área é incrível. Nós temos aí diversos grupos, discussões riquíssimas, pessoas interessadas. Então, a gente pensou que você seria, sim, ótimo para poder trazer um pouquinho dessa visão da importância dessa profissão para o Brasil e também para o mundo. Então, agora, Trevor, por favor.
Muito obrigado, Giovanna. Bom dia, bom dia, bom dia. Meu nome é Trevor Hughes, eu sou o presidente da IAPP, the International Association of Privacy Professionals. É verdade que eu posso falar um pouco de português. Em 1983, 84, eu fui um intercambista na cidade de Três Corações, Minas Gerais, a terra de Pelé. Então, eu não posso falar português para toda esta palestra, so I will speak English for the remainder of my speech. But I am very happy to be here today. Let me just share my screen. There we are, and hopefully you can all see that. This is a very important moment in the world with regards to data protection. We are seeing many things change all around the world. And Giovanna was exactly right when she described the incredible importance of data protection officers. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. This view is particular to the IAPP. We are the world's largest community of privacy professionals with 70,000 members in 150 countries around the world. And we are finding that even in the midst of a global pandemic, that the profession is growing. So I'd like to talk to you about the importance of professionalization today. And I'm actually going to finish my presentation today with a call to action, with a request to all of you to remember professionalization as one of the incredibly important policy tools that we have as we develop laws like the LGPD and like laws in China, India, the United States, and elsewhere around the world. But let's start. First of all, we know that the GDPR has had an enormous effect on data protection globally. I think it is fair to say that many of the ideas and concepts of the GDPR can be found in the LGPD. The GDPR is serving as a global framework for many large organizations. It has had a simply massive influence on global data protection standards. One of the things that's notable in the GDPR is that it recognized the importance of the significance of professionals inside organizations to do the work. So often we talk about what the standards within a law should be, what the legitimate interest for processing, what the legitimate basis for processing, the mechanism for transfers, the structure of a DSAR, and we sometimes forget that you actually need human beings, professionals, people, to do the work inside the organization. Well, the GDPR covers this in a way by having a mandatory data protection officer requirement in many, many circumstances. Now, the IAPP, as a global professional community built to serve people like data protection officers and chief privacy officers, privacy lawyers, anyone working in the field of data protection officers and working in the field of data protection and privacy, we certainly had a great interest in this. And so 2 years ago, we undertook some research where we went to the various data protection authorities in Europe, and we asked them, there is a mandatory data protection officer requirement in the GDPR. You don't have to tell us who they are, but tell us how many have registered in your jurisdiction. At the time, there were 27 member states of the European Union. Of course, now with the United Kingdom and Brexit, there are 26, but we got answers from 17 of them. We found that there were 400,000 400,000 registered data protection officers in Europe. When we extrapolated that number to those countries, the 10 remaining countries that had not responded to us, the 10 remaining jurisdictions, our estimate was, in addition to the 400,000, there was an additional 100,000 data protection officers likely in Europe, for a total of 500,000 data protection officers in Europe. Now, as I mentioned, the IAPP has 70,000 members globally. We have less than 30,000 members in the European Union, and we're certainly aware of our sister organizations in some of the member states of the European Union. It's pretty clear to me that there are some hundreds of thousands of data protection officers in Europe that do not belong to a professional society and likely are not trained or certified or educated in the field of data protection in order to do that work. So we have a massive, massive knowledge, skills, and abilities deficit within the European Union. We know that many people were registered in the European Union without actually being qualified, perhaps, to do the job of being a data protection officer. Now, to be fair, many organizations may not have the luxury of that time and resource to educate a data protection officer. For many smaller organizations, the CEO or the general counsel or someone in the organization may have been given that title in order to have some form of compliance with the GDPR. Well, let's now take it to Brazil and the LGPD. Similar to the GDPR, the LGPD has a mandatory data protection officer requirement in many circumstances. When we looked at the Brazilian marketplace based on the size of the market, based on the number of organizations that may be subject to the requirements in Brazil, our estimate was that Brazil will need 50,000 data protection officers under the LGPD. Now, when we talk about accountability, when we talk about building programs of stewardship, of command and control, of compliance within organizations, when we talk about just responding to these major pieces of data protection legislation, we have to understand that it requires investments in resources within the organization, human resources, technological resources, process resources, so that we can actually give life to these laws. Brazil will need many, many thousands of data protection officers in the future. We are seeing these types of requirements emerge all around the world. Without question, the explosion of data protection laws around the world and the revision of data protection laws. Let's remember, GDPR was a revision of the 1995 EU Data Protection Directive. Canada is revising its data protection law, its privacy law. Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, they are all looking to revise their laws. But other major jurisdictions like China and India, and yes, even the United States, are looking at bringing into effect their first major privacy or data protection laws. So much so that I think it is reasonable to estimate that 50% of the world's population will be subject to their first data protection or privacy law in the coming 2 years. Now, you might say back to me, well, Trevor, that's that's China and India. And in fact, that is significantly the case, but also we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the largest economy in the world, the United States, largest technology provider in the world, the United States, second largest economy, second largest technology provider, China, top 10 GDP nation, India, major data processing outsource center, India, all are looking at data protection laws. Without question, these jurisdictions will drive an enormous amount of expectation, of behavior, of new standards and obligations for data protection professionals globally. And we also shouldn't lose sight of the fact that Brazil is the largest Latin American economy. It is a top 10 GDP nation. It is a global driver as well. And the LGPD now speaks to a new vision for data protection in all of Latin America, frankly, and it also speaks to the global wave of data protection laws that we see emerging. Now, if there are 500,000 data protection officers under the GDPR registered in Europe, if we expect that there will be a need for as many as 50,000 data protection officers in Brazil because of the LGPD, it does not take much math to realize that we may need hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of qualified professionals upon the passage of a Chinese data protection law, an Indian Data Protection Act, and a US privacy law. These new standards will create massive demands for professionalization in our field globally. In fact, the IAPP has done some research. We do an enormous amount of research. Giovanna was very kind in sharing much of what the IAPP does for our members around the world. We looked at data protection officer requirements by country. Over 50 jurisdictions around the world have some form of mandatory training, mandatory role, mandatory professionalization within their data protection or privacy laws. Make no mistake, the data protection professional is an incredibly important part of our policy toolkit as we respond to concerns associated with data in the digital economy. Which brings me to the deficit that we currently have and are facing an even greater deficit in the future. We right now know that data protection professionals with experience, properly trained, are an incredibly important asset in the digital economy. We saw it as a result of GDPR, where salaries were rising based on our salary surveys in Europe. We see it in the United States today, where 5 years of data protection experience is incredibly difficult to find in the marketplace because there were so few of us 5 years ago. The IAPP, not that long ago, only had 10 to 20,000 members. We are 70,000 members today. We know that today there is a deficit in the skills and experience necessary to manage data protection. And as the United States, China, India, other jurisdictions around the world bring on new laws with professionalization, training, and mandatory roles, we know that this deficit will only get greater. What does this mean? Well, first of all, it means that all of you will be very well employed for the rest of your working lives. You are going to be in a very well compensated and successful career for a very long time. Privacy is good business for privacy professionals right now. But it means more than that too. At the IAPP, our mission, we are a not-for-profit organization, and I should mention that we are not an advocacy organization. We do not lobby, we do not go to Brussels or Brasilia or Washington, D.C. to tell governments what privacy laws should look like. No, our mission, our not-for-profit mission, is to define, promote, and improve the profession of privacy globally. We take it as our role to build the profession, to build the professionals necessary to do the work. It is one thing to pass a law, it's very much another thing to give a law life within an organization, to make it work inside an organization, and that takes people. So what are we doing if we have this massive deficit today and we're expecting a deficit going into the future? Well, we are building the programs, the tools necessary, including certifications and trainings on a global basis. I'm very happy to share that we have created a CDPO, a certified DPO program for the Brazilian marketplace in Brazilian Portuguese, built upon our CIPM program with an LGPD component as well. And those two components give you the ability to put forward that you are a certified data protection officer in the Brazilian marketplace. But more than that, we are working on developing the job task analyses, the skills and knowledge and abilities necessary to do the work. To that end, I am one of the chairs of the NIST program, the US NIST, National Institute for Science and Technology. They are working on a privacy workforce public working group, which is built to design and define those skills and abilities that are necessary to perform in the function as a professional in today's data protection role. This is incredibly important work. Think of it as, well, the recipe for what makes a successful privacy professional. What types of skills do you need to put into that recipe so as to get someone who can function as a professional in one of these roles? We are also doing important work to light the fires of professional production. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean higher education. You see, around the world, higher education has not yet realized that there is this current and future deficit in privacy professionals. And there are very, very, very few programs globally that are designed to build future data protection and privacy professionals. So the IEPP is doing work and will publish a survey very soon on those programs globally that are creating classes, degrees, certifications in the field of privacy and data protection. We will be creating master documents of these, inventories of these, and producing these surveys so that wherever you are in the world, you can find a program in your country, in your state, in your jurisdiction, your province, wherever you may be. Even better than that, last year was our 20th anniversary at the IEPP. We set aside a major fund to create the Weston Scholar Awards. Each year, we are going to be able to give away up to 150. We currently have 50, and we are building the program now. 150 scholarships, awards to top students in data protection and privacy programs in universities around the world. Watch our social media. You'll see these students, these bright, shining faces. These are the top students in their data protection and privacy classes. We are on every continent with the Weston Scholar Awards, with the exception of Antarctica. No privacy professionals there yet, unfortunately, but maybe soon. But no, we have many, many awards that we have already given and will continue to give. The reason this is important is it creates awareness of and a pathway to the privacy profession. Like I said, we are firing up the engines of production for professionals. And that means going to higher education. And let me note one important thing. We are not just going to law schools, because the privacy profession is a bit unique. It is a hybridized profession. It is not just lawyers. Certainly an awareness of and understanding, a fluency in the law is important, but you also have to have the ability to understand technology, to understand business process, risk management. There are a number of factors that go into making a successful privacy professional. As a result, we are talking to law schools, computer science schools, business schools, and engineering schools for this purpose. How can you help? Well, I guess I'm going to leave you with a few things, and these are requests for all of you. You are the leaders of privacy and data protection in Brazil and around the world. As you are discussing the policy tools that need to be supported in order to create trust in the digital economy, embrace, understand professionalism as a policy goal. It's absolutely critical that we have the people to do the work. Also, understand that it is your obligation as leaders in the privacy field to develop the next generations of professionals. We will not be able to respond to the risks of data protection and privacy in future years if we do not have many new professionals entering our field. So bring on interns, fellows, mentor, students. Look to building lateral strength within your organization. This one is incredibly important, because we know that there currently are not enough professionals to fill the roles that we have in the field of data protection. It will only get worse in the coming years. You will not be able to find 5 to 7 years of data protection experience. And so most organizations will need to reach laterally to a similarly situated role within the organization. It may be a compliance role, a risk management role, a process management role, and train that person on privacy and leverage the skills that they have from some other lateral parallel domain to data protection and privacy. And that is going to be the most effective way for you to build a privacy program in a stretch of time in which we will have a really hard time finding future professionals. I want to thank all of you for the opportunity to chat with you today. The IAPP is your global professional organization. I shared our mission with you. A way to make our mission a bit shorter and easier to understand is we think that it is our job to make your jobs easier. Our job is to help you do your job every day. We have an enormous amount of resources on our website. Please visit us at iapp.org. And with that, Giovanna, I would be very happy to respond to any questions that there might be.
Evo, muito obrigada por essa fala super inspiradora. Acho que todos nós agora estamos querendo cada vez mais trabalhar com privacidade e proteção de dados depois disso. E espero que todo mundo que esteja assistindo a gente sinta a mesma coisa. Eu sei que a Boiana agora queria fazer uma pergunta para você, ela está aqui com a gente, não estava no programa, mas estou muito feliz, Boiana, de você estar aqui com a gente agora. Então, Boiana, a fala é sua.
Thank you very much, Giovanna. Hello, everybody. I'm sorry I was late. Actually, I was presenting at a Smart Africa Global Summit to African privacy, and I talked about this. And guess what? Angola said, we want to be in Brazil today. I said, well, you can't be in two places at the same time. But Trevor, it's such a pleasure to have you here. And, you know, we wanted you to come and do this inspirational speech because you have been doing this job for so many years. I know you as long as I have been in privacy, and we go such a long way. I had such a pleasure to serve as the chair of the IPP board and really work very closely with you. I think I was the I in the international. That's how I remember our conversation. And I'm delighted. Congratulations. You have built an amazing global organization. You have helped so many professionals. You know, you really so much to be proud of. I was particularly interested and it took away your discussion on deficit of DPOs and how we really need to all mobilize to make sure that we have got enough experts to take us through this new fourth industrial revolution. We talked a lot about that, you know, what the role of DPO, well, what the world looks like. You talked about DPO being the critical foundation, the cornerstone of accountability. And that's, again, absolutely right as well. And my question to you would be, you have seen this role mature and change over time. Tell us a little bit how it has changed over time. So what are the kind of skills that were required 10 years ago, 20, right? What does it look now? And what will it look in the future? So cast your crystal ball in the future as well.
Sure. So hi, Boiana. It's great to see you. And thank you for that question. Let's just go back 25 years even. I started working in privacy and data protection over 20 years ago, almost 25 years ago. And when I first started in privacy and data protection, there were very few lines on the field, if you will. I'll use a football metaphor for Brazil. There were very few lines on the field to understand what was inbounds and what was out of bounds, what was appropriate, what was inappropriate, certainly in the US marketplace, but also globally. The data protection directive was still very new, and very few people understood how to apply it to the internet and the rise of the web. Back then, when I was a chief privacy officer, when I was leading a privacy program, the entire program was run off of email and Excel spreadsheets, the entire program. And it largely was about putting up a privacy policy. We called it back then, we call them statements now, but putting up a privacy policy on our website. And it had very little to do with accountability. I'm almost embarrassed to say now that the actual operational aspects of our privacy program were very few. It was much more about creating a statement that was public facing and trying to understand the very few pieces of guidance that we had from regulators and legislators around the world. That's what it was like 20 years ago. Very little in the way of guidance, very little in the way of operational implementation, very little in the way of accountability, frankly. Those are the two things that have changed the most. Those are the two things. First, we now have more legislation and regulation than it is possible to understand. There are more laws and regulations. There is more guidance from data protection authorities around the world than you could possibly absorb. I don't know if any of you read the daily dashboard that we produce every single day, but it's gotten to the point that even people like myself and Boyana and others who are global privacy figures, it is incredibly hard. Actually, no, it is impossible to know what is happening everywhere, all the time, all around the world. That's the first thing. Second, the operational demands associated with data protection mean that you cannot do it from email and an Excel spreadsheet. You need executive support, you need resources, you need technological solutions, you need a privacy program management platform. You not only need to know how to implement a cookie consent mechanism, but you also have to understand all of the areas in your organization that that cookie consent mechanism is going to create challenges for. So your marketing team may have issues with you. Your product development team may have issues. You need to create a data subject access request platform so that you are processing those efficiently and effectively. The role of privacy and data protection has matured massively. So much so that it is incredibly difficult to manage all of the laws, and it's also incredibly challenging to manage the operational demands. And so we are seeing a broadening, a growth, but also an enormous increase in the complexity of our roles.
Do you think the DPO will also have to have this dual role? I mean, we talked about the Data Protection Authority yesterday having to be smart, effective, risk-based to prioritize. I mean, how is a DPO going to do compliance, but also take into account how do we enable my organization to use data in a better way and responsibly as well? Is that going to be the massive change I think that we're going to see now?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And let's just first note that the data protection officer, as envisioned by the GDPR, is something of a different data protection officer. There is a component of internal audit and review. There is a distance from the operation itself so as to be an ombudsperson, a representative of the GDPR within the organization. That has some challenges associated with it. Many have talked about the role of the GDPR DPO as sometimes having inherent conflicts within the role, because in smaller organizations like the IEPP, frankly, our general counsel is our data protection officer, and she needs to constantly think about which hat she is wearing. So beyond that, the privacy leader, the data protection leader inside an organization is a hybridized leader. They are a hybrid leader. They must be fluent in the laws and complexity, the obligations created by these various standards around the world. At the same time, they have to be effective as a business management leader, a process management leader, because the implementation of data protection within their organization is directly correlated to their accountability, to their compliance with the various standards around the world. They must have enough awareness and understanding of technology to be able to give advice to the various programs within their operation. So today's data protection or privacy leader, the chief privacy officer, some data protection officers, they are a hybrid leader. They need to have many skills. And let me just share, that is not a common that is not a common CV out there in the job marketplace. Finding leaders who have that kind of fluency across those domains, there are very, very few of those people in the world. And so that's a real challenge right now. And it does mean that many organizations will need to fill that role by committee as opposed to by a single CPO or officer. You may have a privacy lawyer, a privacy program manager, a privacy engineering head, and the three of them create a committee of leadership for your organization.
And in fact, you know, Trevor, you're so right. Yesterday, we talked about the need to bring privacy to the board level and how we do that. And this is the job of a privacy leader as well. So this person has to be fluent and be able to mix and rub shoulders with the other leaders of the organization and the boards, and externally with Data Protection Authority and their peers and people like yourselves and so on. So it is a high task, but it's an exciting one. By the way, Trevor, people have asked, where do we get free information? Maybe you just want to say that there's so much free that IAPP offers. So
yeah. So a couple of things. First of all, the IAPP website is a great resource for all of you, iapp.org. And we do have many free resources for you. Certainly the daily newsletter, the daily dashboard, but beyond that, there are thousands upon thousands of papers, research reports, infographics that are available to you. For the Brazilian marketplace, I am very happy to say that we have a growing body of knowledge, of information, of resources for data protection professionals in Brazil. Just recently, we announced the launch of the CDPO, as I mentioned, the Certified Data Protection Officer for the Brazilian marketplace. That includes Brazilian Portuguese training and exams for our major programs. I'm also happy to share that we not only have a country leader who works for the IAPP in Brazil, Dirceu Santos Rosa, but also Danilo Danedo, who may be on the call today, has joined our board of directors. And so we have very strong representation. And I wave the Brazilian flag on the board of the IAPP as a big part of my heart remains Brazilian, having been an exchange student in Brazil. And so we are very much committed to Brazil and to the needs of Brazilian professionals under LGPD. So lots of resources now and lots more resources to come. And you don't even have to be a member. Our website has more than you could read in a lifetime of data protection work, and it's all free. So by all means, visit our website and dive in.
Thank you, Trevor, very much for joining us. We have to now, I think, move on, right? Giovanna is telling me off, but we'd love to talk to you. We'll have that chance again. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, foi prazer.
Thank you.
Muito obrigado. Giovanna, would you like me to now introduce our next keynote speaker?
Sim, por favor, Goiânia.
Okay, it really would be a pleasure to do so. And this is James Snook, who is the Director of Data Policy at the UK government, the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sports. I really had a pleasure to work with James for many months now and to get to know him and his amazing team. We wanted to bring James to talk to you and kind of broaden your horizons of this, first of all, of what is possible in the realm of data protection, how to marry data protection, data-driven innovation, because this is something that UK government is very much intent in doing. And we also wanted to ask James to share with us a little bit of a UK government's journey and thinking in this post-Brexit world. We all are following the news. We know that UK has set many amazing examples in terms of data privacy, from regulatory behaviors to actually accountability to the government policy. But we want to know what this is going to look like post-Brexit. Is there a chance for finding a third new way? We talked about third way for Brazil. Is there a third way with UK and perhaps bridges with Brazil as well? So James, thank you for your time. I know you're super busy organizing G7 as well. So tell us about that as well. And we're delighted to have you. Thank you.
Biana, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Look, thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's great to be following Trevor. Really enjoyed the brilliant presentation he gave and the call for arms really for more expertise and more capacity in what is an incredibly important field. I thought it might be helpful if I just start by introducing my department, because I know the UK landscape won't be familiar to everyone listening into the call today. So the UK's Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport is responsible for digital policy making in the UK government. That includes a very broad portfolio, as you might imagine, but to give you some examples, our department sets the UK agenda on issues like online harms, and you might have seen that the UK has recently set out its legislative approach, the regulation it will create around online harms. We also cover issues like cybersecurity, our digital and technology sectors, and in my case, the use of data within the economy and society. And as Director for Data Policy, I'm responsible for the UK's position on international data flows, data's use in the economy, data protection rules and regulations, among other issues. And I think, Biana, it goes to the points you made in your introduction about how the UK government's thinking on data has evolved over the last few years, both as a consequence of EU exit, but I think also just as a consequence of our catching up, frankly, with the importance of data as an issue in a modern digital economy. But to kind of give you a bit of an example, I joined this department from another bit of the UK government about 3 years ago. And when I joined, the department was, my directorate, my team was 30 people. And we basically just thought about data protection rules and regulation. And we thought about this nascent issue of EU adequacy in the context of EU exit. 3 years on, we're now a team of 150. And data protection remains a really important part of our job, but we are increasingly, and I would say primarily, thinking about data through a much broader lens. Data as and data use as a contributor to growth and innovation. Data as an asset in helping keep the public safe and preserving national security. And yes, data as a question of individual and civil rights that needs to be managed. So it's really been a broadening of our policy approach and a broadening in our appreciation of just how important data is now for a modern digital economy and the opportunities and the risks that brings. So within that context, it's an absolute pleasure to be here to talk about the UK's future approach to data policy. I hope I will set out a third way. I don't tend to use the phrase myself so much, not because it's not a brilliant phrase. I think it really does sum up what the UK is trying to achieve on data, but it has amusing connotations in UK political history, because one of our major political parties campaigned very successfully on delivering a third way for UK politics, but that is not the party that's currently in power. So it would probably not be a great brand to be applying to my data policy. But I'm also really pleased to be talking about our approach to data policy in the context of the broader discussion you're having on the implementation of the LGPD. The UK, and in fact my team, had really welcome conversations with the Brazilian government as they designed that new law. We shared our experiences of having created the UK interpretation of the GDPR through the 2018 Data Protection Act. But we also strongly believe in my team that there are lessons to be learned from all regions in how we best, as governments, maximise the opportunities and minimise the risks that come from data use. So continued collaboration and cooperation globally is going to be an absolute theme of the UK's work on data outside Europe. But let me move on to the nub of my presentation, the UK's national data strategy. And I have to admit, I'm always a little hesitant speaking to global and industry audiences about government strategies. Too often I feel we write these perhaps for a different political audience, or perhaps in trying to write them for all audiences, our key messages get lost. So I wanted to start by putting my remarks and that national data strategy in a broader context. Why the UK felt a national data strategy was needed, why one was needed now, and hopefully I will try and persuade you as to why the UK's data strategy is relevant to you, both in an international but a data protection context. So the first question, why a national data strategy? Well, data is one of the most important assets, as I said, in our modern global and digital economy and societies. I won't use the phrase data is the new oil. I've gained a real dislike to that phrase. I think it does data a disservice, because as an economic asset, data is far more interesting than oil. It's mutable, it's replicable, it's non-exhaustive, it's non-rival, its value and its characteristics change as you accrue more of it and apply it in different ways. And industry studies have shown that sophisticated data using organizations are up to 6% more profitable than their peers. So data and its use potentially raise really interesting new economic opportunities for countries, and they raise new questions around how it can most productively be used that traditional economic assets perhaps have not forced us to confront. And of course, data has always been economically important, back when it was called information and back when it was called knowledge. But its impact is now on a really unprecedented scale. There's research from McKinsey that argue that data flows already account for a higher proportion of global growth and trade in physical goods. And that same analysis by McKinsey estimated that between 2004 and 2014, global data flows raised world GDP by at least 10%. And in 2019, we ourselves have estimated that UK data-enabled experts were worth well in excess of £200 billion and represented 74% of the UK's total service exports. I mean, those numbers are massive. And whilst they may not be perfectly accurate, and I think industry analysis and academic study has a fair way to go in what is still quite a nascent area of research, I don't think anyone is going to dispute the value of data in our modern global economy. And that's only the economy as it exists now. Effective data use, clear rules for data use, and sufficient infrastructure are going to be critical enablers for the fourth industrial revolution and the next wave of technological advancement. The success of world-changing data-driven technologies like artificial intelligence are dependent on reliable access to high-quality stocks and flows of data. So data use and data flows are only going to become more important. And those alone are all good reasons for the government and governments to be clear about the role they will play in enabling that use of data and acting where they feel they need to in governing its use. But data use raises other questions for government. Yes, it's an economic asset, but it's also a critical enabler for improved public services. We saw this through COVID, and I'll turn to this a bit later on. As I said in my opening statements, data use is increasingly important for ensuring public safety and enabling the activities of law enforcement organisations, both within their borders and operating around the globe, as well as preserving national security, where I'm sure everyone listening to the call will be familiar to the vigorous and near constant debate on what is the right balance between government access to data and the protection of individual rights around the national security benefits that that data use can bring. And data will also drive societal progress, particularly through scientific research and innovation. And in the UK, and I saw this firsthand working in the UK government, and I know it was not just in the UK nor in the UK government, but better use and better sharing of data, including between the public and the private sectors, save lives during the COVID pandemic response. And it really does come down to that. So there is, I would say, a responsibility on governments to make sure that data is used as effectively as it can be. And then finally, and perhaps to some of the issues that this audience will be most interested in and will be thinking about on a daily basis, data use also raises big questions about individual rights, privacy, personal control. And those questions are not mutually exclusive from the benefits of public use, of data use. Public trust in the use of data is necessary if we continue to realise its benefits. There's essentially a contract there, and in some instances, an actual contract that GDPR requires for when organisations can access individuals' data and use it either for commercial or non-commercial activity. But those questions and those rights, they can't be entirely protected. I think sophisticated governments, sophisticated organisations need to confront the decisions that must be made on the balance between individual rights, societal rights, and commercial rights, and essentially the choice between preventing data from being used or accessed for certain reasons and not then realizing the benefits of that data use. And I'd say that question is at the heart of our strategy. And those issues cannot all be resolved by the market. Governments need to set political positions in line with the values and objectives of their countries. And the UK was one of the first countries to do this with our national data strategy, but I'm very confident that we're not going to be the last. And I think many jurisdictions, if not all jurisdictions, are going to find a way in some form to publish a national policy position on how they feel data should be used in their economies and within their societies. So that was question one, why a national data strategy? I hope I've persuaded you there's some value here in the UK government and other governments articulating their policy positions. The second question I posited was why now? And I've probably perhaps, I hope I've largely answered that for you in setting out some of the compelling policy questions and policy opportunities that data use raises. But I think my main answer to why now, my main reflection on why now, is I think, as is often the case with governments, to be frank, I feel that we've actually come to this issue late, having woken up to the global and national importance of data use. I think that really this is an area where all governments needed to have a clear position 5-10 years ago. And I hope the UK has a clearer position now. But we are late, as all governments and all jurisdictions are late. And while I can't turn back the clocks, I think that governments and policymakers need to recognise just how rapidly technology is transforming how data can be collected, shared and used. And that means we need to work harder to keep up with that. And it means that we need an agile approach to our policy, to our laws and regulations, because the world won't wait. And if our laws are not fit for purpose, they will either impede progress or they will create new risks where they're not keeping up with the challenges that data use perhaps presents to society. And finally, and before I promise I will talk a little bit more about what our strategy actually says, my final question, why the UK strategy is relevant to you. And this really does go back to Bjorn's point about what the UK can do. I strongly believe that the UK's global position presents a great opportunity on data and on the partnership that we can have with industry and other countries. I think it is an opportunity for the UK to be more competitive, to contribute more at a global level, and to attract scientific progress and innovation and industry to the country. Absolutely, there are benefits for us, but I also think it's an opportunity for like-minded partners to work with us. And the reason for that is, well, there are a few reasons for that. One, we've left the EU. Of course, a defining aspect of our current position in the world and our current approach to policy. But in having left the EU, we now have control over our data laws. We've repatriated powers governing the transfer of personal data from the UK. And we will represent and advocate for our own positions for international policy on data. And outside of Europe, I also think we can do this more agilely, and I hope more comprehensively than the European regime has been able to do to date. And as you will hopefully have taken from my opening remarks, we are looking at data use from all angles, not solely privacy, which I think has dominated much of the global discussion. And then finally, why I think we are well situated here is that we have a long history of a commitment to high data protection standards, to global cooperation, to liberal trade policies, and to pragmatic law and regulation. I think that is what is needed in this space. And I think all of that positions us to be an active global leader on data policy issues. One, I hope, that can create the best, most coherent and stable domestic environment for data using organisations, but also it positions the UK to be willing to lead discussions across the globe to create a more sustainable and predictable legal and regulatory environment for business and, frankly, for countries and governments. And I'll talk a little bit more about what we're doing there later on, as I know it's of great interest to this audience. So I hope from that context, it does encourage you to want to work with us, to understand what we're doing and share information about what you're doing. But let me give you a little more detail about what is actually in our national data strategy. We published the strategy in September 2020, and we positioned it as a framework for achieving an ambition of building an innovative, pro-growth, data-driven economy that was underpinned by public trust in such a way that data worked for everyone across society. And I'd say our strategy is underpinned by a core position, a core policy position, which is that we must rebalance the debate on data from one where we only see the risks of data use, which I would say has dominated the public narrative for the last 5 or 10 years, to one where we are also actively considering the opportunities of data use and taking account of the cost of not using data. And we see that as meaning we need to create a regime, comprehensive data regime in the UK that doesn't just focus on privacy, but can unleash the power of data across the whole of the economy and the society. And I won't bore you by covering all 80 pages of what the strategy says. For those of you that are really, really interested, it's available on the gov.uk website. But I'll instead focus on the 5 missions we set out in the strategy. And these are the areas where we think government has the greatest role to play. Because, of course, an awful lot of what we're trying to achieve here will not be achieved by government. It will be achieved by companies. It will be achieved by NGOs. It will be achieved by data-using organisations who will drive far better benefits and far more innovation than government ever could. But we do think there is a role for government to play in certain areas. And I wanted to touch on those briefly. I won't list everything we're trying to do. The first mission is about unlocking the full value of data held across the economy. This is about policy that treats data as an economic asset, as I set out at the start. This is about productivity. This is about innovation. This is about making sure that those organizations can get the most value out of data, can access it. It is classic economic policy making. And so within that, we are looking at our digital competition regime, around whether there are inappropriate barriers within the market around data access. We're looking at where government might invest to create the infrastructure or the frameworks needed to enable greater data access and collaboration. And we're looking, frankly, at where government should stay the hell out of the way and let the market deliver as it best does. My personal view is this area is probably the single biggest area of opportunity to improve data use in the UK and, frankly, globally. I don't think any country has yet created the optimal ecosystem for getting the most out of data within their economy, within their society. So that's mission 1. Mission 2, we've called securing a pro-growth and trusted data regime. This is really at the heart of what I was saying around the rebalancing of the debate between a sole focus on risk and then the opportunities. We want to create a regime that continues to protect data to a high standard while also creating optimal conditions for growth and innovation. We intend to take an outcomes-based approach to regulation, as we have done in all other areas of modern regulation in the UK. We want to maintain public trust, but we also want to remove unnecessary and disproportionate burdens, particularly on smaller organisations who perhaps are asked to do too much. And we also want to provide more clarity to organisations on how they are allowed to use data. We hear a lot about risk aversion and hesitation in the face of regulation and the possibility of sanctions that is impeding organisations that would otherwise want to use data in a responsible manner. And we hope that this will establish the UK as one of the most attractive data destinations for businesses from all over the world. And harking back to Trevor's point earlier, in that there are already too many rules to keep track of, a view that I have a great degree of sympathy with, our approach here is going to be underpinned by the recognition that we in the UK are part of a bigger global ecosystem, a bigger global regulatory system. And we're not interested in creating unnecessary new or bespoke rules or burdens for organisations that already have more than enough to deal with. Mission 3, transforming government's use of data to drive efficiency and improve public services. I don't think it will be any surprise to people on this call that our conclusion is that the UK government can get way more out of the data assets that they currently hold than they do. And I don't think we're alone in that. I think generally on all issues of digital and technology use, including data, governments are much further behind than industry, and we need to catch up. And citizens expect us to. Contrary to a lot of what is said about privacy concerns, analysis we've done shows that most UK citizens expect the government to make better use of data that they're required to provide to governments. They expect that data to be used to deliver better and more efficient services, and they don't want to be asked repeatedly for the same information. And our guide through all of this will be the high watermark that was set during the COVID pandemic for how data was used in the UK government, which was truly transformational. It was used ethically, it was used responsibly, it was used efficiently, but it was used to save lives, and we need to sustain that level of capability. And so a core part of our approach in the UK is going to be making sure that government is maximising the value of data, not just our economies and societies. Mission 4 is perhaps a slight departure, but going back to Biana's point about putting all of this conversation in a broader context, I think we have to recognise, and particularly governments have to recognise, that the increasing importance of data in the workings of our economy and society means we're increasingly dependent on it, and we're increasingly dependent on the data infrastructure that supports its use. One of the urgent pieces of work my team did during COVID was work with the data centre sector in the UK to make sure that they were protected from lockdown, that they had emergency access to their facilities, that they could essentially keep the infrastructure running at a time when the entire country, and frankly the entire globe, was incredibly dependent on our data infrastructure to continue to work. And of course, the only reason I'm able to speak to you virtually today is because we have the data infrastructure in place that enables it. We have to recognise that that increased dependence is a risk. And we have to recognise that data infrastructure is now critical to the running of our economies and the running of our public services, and it needs to be treated as such by governments. And in the UK, at least, I expect that means that we will need to introduce a stronger risk management framework to ensure the threats and the hazards that face that data infrastructure are being managed at the level they need in the national interest and not just in the commercial interest. And I hope that that will be reassuring to those organisations that also depend on that infrastructure to know that they are being held to a high standard for maintaining their services, for maintaining the integrity of their data and the confidentiality of their data. Finally, Mission 5, possibly the one you're most interested in, championing the international flow of data. I'll say the most about this mission and the UK's international policy for data, as I'm sure it's of interest from you. And our position here starts from the fact that the trusted exchange of information across borders underpins global business operations. It enables trade, it supports international cooperation. International data transfers have never been more important, and yet with court cases, regulatory intervention, global regulatory fragmentation, transferring data internationally has perhaps never been more challenging and more risky. And so creating a stable, predictable, legal and regulatory framework globally is critical to ensuring data can be used responsibly to drive growth, boost scientific progress, and all those other benefits I've talked about. And the UK wants to play a global leadership role in achieving this, which we are fully conscious is a multi-year, possibly even decades effort, but one that we think is really, really important. And so now the UK has left the EU, we are capitalising on that newfound sovereignty to promote the benefits of global data flows. We want to free up data so it reaches its full potential and not hoard it away and limit what it can achieve within borders. And we want to steer the global debate on data in that direction so that data is recognised and embraced as a force for good. We absolutely recognise that different nations will inevitably take different approaches to data, underpinned by their differing considerations around economics, security, privacy, and the values they hold in society. And that may provide some legitimate exceptions to the free flow of data. However, the UK has an opportunity, we think, to manage that interplay and balance the interest between data powers. And so in this context, we are committed to working with international partners to promote the trusted free flow of data across borders, to remove unnecessary barriers to these flows, and to hopefully help shift the global approach to data to one that works in the interest of all as we build a more sustainable and fairer global economy. We have already started on this. Biana mentioned the G7 track. Last month, the G7 digital and technology ministers led by the UK government signed off an ambitious declaration that commits us to developing a roadmap for cooperation on data free flow with trust, which we intend to use to boost collaboration on priority areas for data sharing. And later this year, we'll convene a meeting of the G7 data regulators to promote good regulatory practices to support this goal. And we think this shows what the UK can achieve as a leader of these debates, as a respected participant in the international debate with a respected data protection authority in the Information Commissioner's Office, and with, and I will use the phrase, the offer of a potential third way that can cut through some of the debate globally that has perhaps stalled progress for the last few years. And we're not limiting our action to what we do internationally and globally in cooperation with others. We also have the opportunity to lead domestically. Having left the European Union, we have repatriated powers that allow us to strike our own new UK adequacy agreements and form data partnerships with economies around the world. We intend to be bold and open, creative and pragmatic in how we use our adequacy powers and our other tools. And we'll be publishing more on this and announcing our priority countries of focus shortly. And if you're interested in that, Joe Jones, the head of my data adequacy team in the UK, is going to be talking about our work in more detail on the next panel event. And we also have a supportive regulator in the Information Commissioner's Office that sees the need to support this work, to ensure that UK transfer mechanisms are deployed pragmatically and creatively, and can work with other regulators and other jurisdictions globally to enable greater recognition of others' tools and others' bases for allowing data to flow across borders. So working internationally and with an international mindset is going to be a key aspect of our approach to data. And it's one of the reasons I was so keen to speak at this event today. So let me draw my remarks to a close. I won't go deep into our strategy. As I said, there is much, much more, and there will be more to come, especially in the next few months. So do keep an eye out for UK activity if you're interested. And I hope I've demonstrated the importance that the UK is giving to this agenda, the political priority that it has within our government, and the significance that we think it represents to all governments going forward. And I hope I've persuaded you of the opportunity that exists for us to work together. And if you do want to reach out to me after the event, I'm sure the organisers will be happy to share my contact details. And so rather than repeat and wrap up my comments, I thought what might be interesting is to share what UK stakeholders, industry, charities, privacy lobby groups, the public said in response to the consultation we launched on our national data strategy and which closed a couple of months ago. So while many respondents recognised the need to rebalance the narrative, as I discussed, moving away from thinking about data use primarily as a threat to be managed and instead recognising it as an asset that can be used responsibly to deliver economic and public benefits, I think that's positive. I think it's also a better reflection of what industry and the public really think about data use than we've perhaps heard in the media and from prominent groups where the focus has been almost solely on privacy group concerns that, whilst important, are not entirely representative of the issues around data use. Respondents did underline the need to ensure that data is used responsibly, and particularly that the data revolution works for everyone and everywhere. And I'm sure this is part of conversations you're having in your organisations around the risk of bias, around representation, around what it means to be accountable for the decisions reached on the basis of data use, as well as how that data is collected and analysed in the first place. And I'm sure the UK won't be alone in that thinking. And given the significance of the issues around data use, the respondents to our consultation almost entirely all highlighted the importance of continued conversation and debate between policymakers and stakeholders in this, and particularly between members of the public as well, in helping to raise data literacy, to raise the understanding of how data can be used and the risks and benefits that come with it, but also to raise understanding of the value of data use. And finally, the consultation feedback confirmed what we were already committed to, but what is helpful to know, which is that the UK should continue to operate a data protection regime that encourages responsible data use and maintains public trust, which I think is critical for any modern digital economy. So there's more to think about. Our national data strategy was the start of a conversation, certainly not the end. And there are more conversations to be had, more challenges to confront on the way. And I'm hopeful that we're taking steps to make the UK the leader in those conversations and the number one data destination and data policymaker globally. So thank you very much for listening to me today, and I hope that I've been able to shed some light on the UK's future approach to data policy. I don't think I'm down to take questions, although if the organisers correct me on that, I'm very happy to. But as I said, I'm very happy to have my contact details shared and to follow up with any of the audience offline. Fiona, thank you ever so much. Back over to you.
Yeah, James, this was another really inspirational keynote, but also a bold one that was really tour de force, explaining what is possible in the realm of data policy. And it's not a third way, it's a new way, right? And I think that's the word we should be using. I'm absolutely with you. Data is not the new oil. You said data revolution has to work for all. And I think data has to work for all, right? So, I talk about data as a new environmental protection. We need data in the system to nurture and to make it sustainable, so that we can all benefit from it. So it was truly inspirational. I'm getting signals. I mean, people do want to ask questions, but I'm getting signals that we are far too late now, and we really have to move to the next panel. I know Joe is going to pick up some of the stuff that you have left, but it was incredibly amazing, and we will invite you back. I think Brazil is going to particularly be interested in the work that you are doing to outcome-based regulation, a smart risk-based regulator that also works for large companies as well as SMEs. This is a country where there are lots of SMEs, so it's important to ensure everybody gets their fair share of data. And there are many business leaders on this call beyond Brazil, so I know they appreciate hearing from UK about the New Deal for data. So thank you, James, very much. And back to you, Giovanna, for the next panel, right?
Back to Marcus, actually. I'm happy for Marcus to continue from here. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Bojana, and everybody on this call today. Welcome to our first panel of the day, the panel on enabling international transfers across regions. The title quite appropriately signals that global data flows are fundamental to our economies and societies, that they must be enabled. And that's the premise for this panel, of course. And we've already heard this message loud and clear from a number of speakers in the past 2 days, that global data flows must be enabled. It's widely understood that the modern digital economy and society depend on having access to personal data and on moving data across borders globally. As Simon McDougall from the UK ICO said yesterday, for example, we live in a world where every service is now data-driven. And that, of course, involves transferring data across borders and regions. James Snook just now pointed out that the enormous impact global data flows have on global economic growth. So clearly, for Brazil's businesses to flourish in the global digital economy, they must be able to receive data across borders, share data across borders. And in fact, if you attended yesterday's session, you will have heard Laura Schertl from the IDP say that data is impossible to regulate locally. Data is flowing globally. Data protection laws regulate something that flows, that is constantly in motion on a global level. So despite the simplicity of this basic fact, the question of how to actually facilitate such data flows has confounded us collectively, globally, for a long time now. Transfer restrictions are increasingly common in data protection laws. The requirements are becoming more stringent. Data localization is on the rise. And it seems that ensuring reliable and efficient cross-border data flows is becoming more and more complex and difficult, even as the importance of such data flows becomes more and more clear. And if we, for some reason, didn't know that before COVID, the pandemic has taught us clearly that our economies are globally interconnected. Our scientific research is globally interconnected. Our societies, our cultural lives are interconnected. Indeed, our lives are globally interconnected. And as a result, our personal data also has to flow along each of these interconnections globally. Bojana showed us some interesting statistics yesterday that showed the amazing data explosion during 2020 due to the pandemic, using some statistics around e-commerce platforms, global communication platforms, payment tools that all have experienced exponential growth in terms of personal data use at a global level. So why can't our data transfer frameworks reflect this fact? If data flows are indeed fundamental to our global economy, to e-commerce, to communication, to technological development, innovation, research and societal advancement in general, cross-border data transfers shouldn't be that complex, yet they appear to be. But of course, we can't throw our hands in the air, and we are not. Law and policymakers, regulators, and industry are all now diligently working on figuring this out all around the world and in many different fora like APEC, the OECD, and in our individual countries and regions. And they, or I should say we, might even solve the issue on data flows comprehensively at some point, hopefully not too far in the distant future. And we just heard from James Snook that the UK actually intends to take a leadership role in this effort, and which is very good to hear. And we look forward to following and supporting that. But while all of this is taking place, Brazil, of course, specifically the ANPD and Brazilian companies must now implement Brazil's own transfer regime and develop all the transfer tools available under the LGPD to maximize the ability of Brazilian businesses of all sizes to share, to access, to receive data across Brazil's border in order to flourish in this global interconnected economy. Indeed, as Laura Schertl said yesterday, and actually today again, implementing the LGPD is really all about realizing the amazing opportunities for Brazil, but only if data can move. So in this panel, we will discuss that particular effort, and we will consider Brazil's immediate tasks to develop its cross-border transfer framework and mechanisms in the context of what other countries and legal systems around the world are currently doing on that front. So we will ask, what can Brazil learn from other jurisdictions? What are some of the key challenges and opportunities for improving the ease and the effectiveness of cross-border data transfers for Brazil and other countries on this call right now? How can we govern data transfers in a way that engenders trust in citizens and all stakeholders, as Giovanna already said in her opening remarks this morning? So to discuss these issues, we have an excellent panel of distinguished experts and privacy practitioners from around the world to share their views and experiences. Let me briefly introduce the provocateurs for this session in the order in which I plan on asking them to speak. First, we have Miriam Wimmer, who is director at the ANPD, which is the new Data Protection Authority for Brazil, of course. Then we have Juji Asai, who is commissioner at the Personal Information Protection Commission in Japan. Then we have Joe Jones, head of data adequacy at the UK Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, also known as DCMS. Then we have Kate Charlotte, who is director for data governance at Google, followed by Jacobo Eskenazi, who is global privacy strategist at HP Inc., followed by Marcel Leonardi, who is a partner at Leonardi Advogados, and Vanessa Butala, legal director at Serasa Experian in Brazil. So I will ask each of them in turn 1 or 2 initial questions to which they can then respond in about 7 minutes or less. And in the remaining time, we'll open it up to questions from all of you who are participating today and try to have a discussion and comment on what we've heard. So please ask your questions in the Q&A box throughout this panel. And with that, let me turn to Miriam with my first set of questions for her. Miriam, thank you for joining today. So Miriam, on the ANPD's work plan for 21-22, the ANPD prioritized a number of activities. Among other things, the ANPD said it would start working on international data transfers in the first half of 22. I understand that the ANPD actually has already started to consider what steps it will need to take to enable international data transfers between Brazil and other countries. Could you explain to us the ANPD's initial thinking on this topic and what data transfer mechanism the ANPD might prioritize initially? Over to you, Miriam.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for your great introduction. Thank you also, Boyana, Giovanna, Laura, and all those responsible for organizing this incredible panel. I'm delighted to share some information on what we've been discussing here in Brazil concerning international data transfers and cross-border data flows. And I think before diving into the topic, it's important to mention that in Brazil, unlike the European Union, for instance, we don't have a very long discussion on data protection. This is still a fairly new topic for us. Our law was approved only in 2018. It entered into force last September. ANPD was then created only in November. So although we did have a 10-year period leading up to the approval of the law, it's still fairly new. And in this sense, we are dealing with some very basic aspects of domestic implementation that have already been solved for many years in other countries. And I think basically when we look at the challenges of implementing LGPD, this concerns not only drawing up the rules and providing the correct guidance, but in a more general sense, promoting a cultural change that allows organizations and also data subjects to understand what these new rules entail and how they can handle data responsibly. So basically, we've very quickly migrated from a regime where there were no rules, in fact, on international data transfers, except for perhaps some regulated sectors where there may have been specific rules. And now we have a legal framework which requires us to have legal basis for transferring data internationally. And all of these legal mechanisms require further development and further implementation by ANPD, as you correctly noted, Marcus. So in fact, I think one of the main challenges we have at this point is establishing priorities. ANPD as a new body has to deal with many different issues, which include not only discussing with our regulated entities, companies, but also data subjects, what needs to be done for domestic implementation, but also dealing with our own legal nature, our own institutional structure, in order to allow us to become more effective. And in order to address these challenges, during the very early days of ANPD's existence, we worked on drawing up our strategic plan and also our regulatory agenda. And it's important to note that there is no legal requirement to draw up these documents, but we did so in the spirit of being very transparent and very open about what we're planning to do. And our regulatory agenda, in fact, covers a 2-year period and lists 10 different items which need to be addressed during this period. Some of them have already been resolved. For instance, we already have our internal rules of procedure. We already have our strategic plan. We have already begun public consultations on specific rules for SMEs, also on rules for dealing with data breaches and security incidents. And we did plan, as you mentioned, Marcus, to begin dealing with international data transfers in the first semester of next year. I think it's important to note at this point that the fact that we formally stated that we would begin working next year does not mean, in fact, that we are not working. Much to the contrary, we have already begun studying and discussing this issue with our colleagues, both in the public sector and other DPAs, but also within the private sector. And I think that as we move forward, it's important to state that we are very much aware of the importance of cross-border data flows in the global digital economy. In fact, for many years now, Brazil has been taking part in discussions at the OECD, for instance, on digital transformation. We very much agree with the idea of free flow of data with trust, although this is a concept that is still fairly broad and needs to be more fleshed out, more specified in terms of rules and mechanisms that enable data to flow. And I think we are also very much aware of the challenges that firms face nowadays as they have to work across different jurisdictions with different approaches. And in this sense, I think it was very interesting to hear the previous speaker mention that we are part of a larger global regulatory regime in terms of data transfers, and that it does make sense for us to work towards greater interoperability and to greater harmonization of our laws in order to facilitate these data flows. Having said that, LGPD, in fact, has an approach that is quite similar to the GDPR in the sense that it provides for a portfolio of mechanisms to enable international data transfers. So we have, of course, adequacy, but then also instruments such as standard contractual clauses, binding corporate rules, codes of conduct, certifications, as well as other provisions related, for instance, to international cooperation between governments, but also fulfillment of contracts or carrying out of legal obligations. I think one important difference to the GDPR is that in Brazil, companies are not allowed to rely on legitimate interest to transfer data internationally, but generally speaking, the mechanisms are very similar. They are quite comparable. So at this point at ANPD, it seems to us that our priority should be on creating mechanisms that are uncomplicated, that are simple, that are off the shelf, so to speak, that large companies and small companies alike can easily incorporate into their business practices, into their contracts. And in this sense, standard contractual clauses, in fact, seem to be the best way to move forward in terms of priorities. This does not mean that we are not interested in other mechanisms. I do believe, in fact, that we have to explore all of these mechanisms. For instance, we have a very good conversation with the European Commission, and I think that an adequacy finding in the future may be something we are interested in discussing. But in the short term, I think STCs are, in fact, the easiest mechanism to focus on to enable companies to quickly become compliant with LGPD, because in fact, we have a quite tricky situation at this point where the law requires certain legal bases to be in place for data to be transferred, but they are not yet fully developed in the regulatory scenario. So we have initiated discussions, as you mentioned, Marcus. We have been discussing with CIPL, for instance, but also with other stakeholders in the private sector. We have had great discussions with the DCMS. I'd like to say hi to Joe Jones. We met very recently on a digital dialogue between Brazil and UK, but also FTC and regulators in other countries. And I think that this panel is particularly interesting because, as was mentioned earlier, UK, Japan, and Brazil are in somewhat of a unique situation because we have strong ties to the European approach, but also we have commercial connections and relationships with countries that have different approaches, that do not have an ex-ante approach towards personal data protection. So I think from our point of view at this point, we're interested in understanding the discussion in Europe, understanding the consequences of the Schrems decision, the guidance of the EDPB, but also interested in figuring out what other approaches would be interesting for us to adopt, having in view this need to make it possible for Brazilian companies to export data and also to receive data coming from other countries. I'd like to conclude these opening remarks by saying that the aim of data protection legislation, as was stated previously, is not to restrict the flow of data, but enable data to flow while maintaining high levels of protection, while maintaining trust. And I think as a new authority, we have been made to feel very welcome by other authorities, by other DPAs, and we have also received great input from private sector stakeholders, and we very much look forward to continue exploring these mechanisms and also learning from the experience of other countries. So I look forward to listening to the other panelists and to answer any questions further on. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Miriam. There was a lot there, very encouraging, everything that you do at the moment. I'm particularly encouraged by how open the INPD is being with the regulated entities, the transparency that with which you plan to go forward, the consultation that's already taking place, and the engagement with industry. That's very encouraging. And also your practical approach to transfer, starting with what appears to be the easiest mechanism to get something in place for companies to use. So that's all very encouraging. We have to move on to the next panelist right now. Commissioner Asai from the Personal Information Protection in Japan. Thank you for joining this panel today. Let me ask you my initial questions to you, Commissioner. In 2019, Japan and the EU mutually recognized each other as adequate under your respective data protection regimes. Could you talk about the steps that Japan took to achieve EU adequacy, and also in particular addressing the supplemental measures Japan had to adopt to attain adequacy? And also, Japan is currently working on the DFFT, the Data Free Flow with Trust initiative, in the context of the World Economic Forum. That initiative aims to map a multi-dimensional architecture for international cooperation on data flows. Could you also explain briefly this initiative and outline whether there is any possibility for Brazil to take part in it? Over to you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Marcus. I am Yuji Asai. I'm quite new or stranger for everybody. Actually, I came in Personal Information Protection Commission in Japan in February. Also, I'm quite new for privacy world. I'm very, very happy to be here today. Thank you for inviting me. It is an honor, actually, for me to participate on this excellent seminar. I try to speak the good information to respond to you, Marcus, and everybody you are expecting. Before I try to speak, a little reminder, you know, my time is 11 p.m. Normally, I jump to the bed. So thank you for your patience on my face in case turning too sleepy. So anyway, I try to wake up. Let me start. I have a PowerPoint presentation here with you. PPC Japan achieved mutual adequacy decision with EU. It has enhanced cooperative relationship. And based on that, we have now been working for promotion of data free flow with trust. I try to speak today about that right. The free flows of personal data and trust stay never separated. Even among the different countries, they are ensured when sharing the fundamental values to say democracy, rule of law, a rule of law, and respective human rights. And next, please. Yes. Now, I try to tell you about our experience of the mutual recognition between Japan and EU. You come to know it is an example of sharing the fundamental values. Please flip. This mutual recognition came to be possible only because Japan and the EU have the similar frameworks on cross-border transfer regulations. This shows you the very framework to reach the mutual recognition, especially in the red circle. Flip to the next. You find here 5 key requirements as Japan designated EU, but work in the mutuality. Next, please. We kicked the step on July 2016. It takes actually 2.5 years to reach the mutual recognition. You find here our dialogues in history with EU, over more than 300 hours in total, or 80 meetings until the final agreement. Next, please. We know there are various differences between APPI and the GDPR. Naturally, differences in culture and history and more. All through our dialogues based on mutual understanding, PPC came to address these 5 key items by establishing supplementary rules. These would be, we should say, a bridge between APPI and GDPR. Next, please. I'd like to talk about the promotion of the data free flow with trust, or DFFT. PPC has been deepening the collaboration with EU, also with the US, through the promotion of cross-border personal data flow within APEC region. The efforts toward DFFT are based on the cooperative relationship with the US and EU. You see, in the rapid technological innovation and diverse national and regional policies, Japan, US, EU, and other like-minded countries need to work closely together. The leadership would mean to establish an international framework of data flow. Japan proposed the concept of DFFT at a meeting on World Economic Forum in January 2019. Also, to promote international rules for data flow, Japan did lead to the establishment of Osaka Track at the G20 summit held in June 2019. In addition to such international discussions, Japan government formulated data strategy in last December. Next, please. To facilitate DFFT, PPC has worked with both US and EU, the privacy policymakers, to develop a concrete forwarding framework based on the relationship. PPC has also advocated proposals to US and to stimulate discussion. One of the proposals is to explore the possibility to introduce a new global corporate certification system. The discussion has not reached at a concrete stage yet, but we will continue the discussion. We look for that corporate certification system would be used by countries around the world, of course, including Brazil in the future, I think. Flip next. Here, other proposal is to lead international discussions at OECD on emerging risks in personal information protection. In these years, some countries are adopting problematic data policies, such as unlimited government access and data localization. It is often criticized that they will become big obstacles to trusted free flows of personal data. Next, please. Therefore, PPC proposed to discuss these emerging risks among OECD members through the review process for privacy guidelines. PPC has been playing a leading role in these discussions at the OECD meetings. It comes to the result. The statement on unlimited government access was published in December last year. Next, please. Finally, the last slide shows you the various international frameworks that PPC is engaging. PPC is looking for the opportunity to widely share and promote our efforts. Moreover, we actively contribute to discussions on countermeasures against COVID-19. It is to address issues relating to the protection of personal information. It has actually arisen in the context of recent technological innovation. It would be also a strong interest of Brazil, hopefully, to use these frameworks for international cooperation and to learn from the best practices of other countries. I hope our efforts would mean a reference for Brazil's international data protection policy. Thank you for listening to me. It's good for me to still waking up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Asai, for this tremendously informative presentation about so many important issues that really show how the leadership role Japan has taken in global data privacy and data flow issues. So that's really interesting. It's interesting to see you describe the adequacy process, how complicated it can be just between two countries, but also how through creative thinking and thoughtfulness, gaps can be closed and arrangements, bilateral arrangements and adequacy findings can be achieved. It's also very encouraging to hear you speak about the data forum for the DFFT initiative. Data flows with trust is what the world needs right now. So this is a very promising development that I hope many countries, including Brazil, will be able to participate in and support. And also to hear you about the important OECD work on government access and data localization is tremendously important. Again, thank you for your leadership in that. And also, I also support your comment that Brazil should try to participate in as many of these international transfer mechanisms as possible, including the CBPR. I believe that was tremendously helpful and something to think about. And also your comments on developing a global certification that potentially could be modeled on the CBPR. That's very important to pursue further, I think. So thank you. I have to move on to the next provocateur, and there might be some follow-up questions if we have time at the end for some of you. But let's now move to Joe Jones from the DCMS in the UK. Joe, if I could ask you my questions or my group of questions. Both the UK and Brazil are currently working towards enabling international data transfers, as we discussed. The UK now post-Brexit, of course, and Brazil now under the new LGPD. And both countries also have stated ambitions to become global leaders in the digital space. So based on the UK's substantial experience with cross-border data transfers, what are some of the key data transfer mechanisms that Brazil now should be focusing on in the short term and in the midterm to enable data transfers, particularly considering the importance and relevance of SMEs to the Brazilian economy? Also, what will the UK's priorities be in terms of adequacy determinations with respect to third countries and enabling data flows post-Brexit? And do you think Brazil might be one of the priority countries for the UK in terms of adequacy and mutual adequacy? Thank you, Joe.
Thanks very much, Marcus. And it's a pleasure and honor to be here and on such a distinguished panel as well. I've enjoyed all the talks before me, and it's good to see some familiar faces. So on your first question, look, I think it's incredibly important that we recognize that privacy issues and data protection issues are fundamentally cultural. How we protect data and how we protect the right to privacy is rooted in our national identity, in our constitution, in our legal traditions, in our history, and in our lived experiences. And with that in mind, it's not right to suggest that there is one law that should apply to every country. Every country has got to find its own way navigating these issues. And I think the Data Free Flow with Trust initiative really, and with thanks to the leadership from Japan, is a great example of this, because what we want to do is we want to work towards shared principles, shared frameworks, and importantly, shared outcomes. But we are allowing and we're recognizing and we're embracing different ways to get to those outcomes, because it's the way we get there that needs to reflect our cultural identity and our cultural differences. So it's not for me in the UK to suggest that another country must do it the way the UK does it. But I think it is right that we have conversations like the one we're having today, where we talk about our shared values on data protection and what we think high standards of data protection means in practice. And the UK is very well placed to do that. We have a very long-standing history and commitment to high standards of data protection. We've always been a very pragmatic, flexible, creative, and outward-facing country. And we will look forward to speaking with partners across the world to actually better understand how they regulate these issues, how things happen on the ground, and how we can find commonalities and shared practices. Brazil is a really interesting, great case in point. You know, divining inspiration from its approach from the GDPR, from other sources, and making it work in a Brazil context. Japan has done similar, and countries around the world are doing this. We've never seen such a sharp rise in countries around the world adopting data privacy legislation, and they're all doing it in ways that reflect their unique circumstances. So the opportunity has never been greater because there's just so much out there, and the need to collaborate has never been more important. COVID has shown that. And the challenges are that we have got to focus on the outcomes, and we've got to be very open, and we have to be quite pragmatic and risk-based as we think through the differences and think through the solutions. And importantly, we have got to be very bold here. And we've got to act on these issues now. And so the UK is very ambitious. And on your second question, Marcus, we're very ambitious in how we think we can do data adequacy. Just like the Japanese, we went through many hours of negotiations with the EU, many meetings, many sessions. We are still going through it. Just today, we were listening to a debate in the European Parliament about whether the UK should be adequate. So we've lived that experience. We know what it's like. We think there is an opportunity to do adequacy differently, still focusing on high standards of protection and the outcome. But we think adequacy can be done more mutually, in a more collaborative way, and bringing countries together, rather than it feeling like a one-way process where one country is under the microscope and the other is assessing. We think this should really be a joint exercise. And some of the initiatives around the world, the OECD, the APEC CBPRs, they all have that as their inspiration. This is a mutual endeavor between like-minded countries pulling together in the same direction. And that, I think, really is how adequacy should be done. But we are not doing adequacy to compete with the EU. Right? This is not about the UK running a long list of countries for the sake of having a long list of countries. Because what we don't want in 5 years and 10 years are 200 countries that have 200 different adequacy lists. I think that would be very challenging for privacy practitioners. I think it would be very challenging for governments and organizations. What we do want, though, is we do want to show how it can be done. Right? And so in the UK, having inherited the adequacy mechanism, wants to show and demonstrate how it can be done more creatively and how it can be done more pragmatically. And the hope and what we will be trying to do is show and tell that to the rest of the world, and use international conversations and dialogues like the UK's leadership of the G7 this summer, to demonstrate how these issues can be worked on in partnership. And of course, we'll be speaking with our counterparts in the European Commission, we'll be speaking with Miriam and Mr. Asai, and we'll be working through all of these issues together in the hope that we have more mutual and mutually compatible frameworks. And I think that has got to be the longer term vision for data transfers, and not this sort of 20th century approach to 21st century issues, where we imagine data going from point A to point B and that's all that's happening. That's not what's happening in the real world. I mean, just this panel alone is requiring and involving data transfers from all around the world, all at different time zones, we're all in our homes, some of us are in the office. So, you know, data transfers are not as simple as we might have thought about them back in 1995 when we had the data directive. And we have got to respond to that. Governments, organizations, and individuals, we all have to respond to that and make sure we design the tools and implement them that fit the reality of the day.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Joe. I think your comments really highlighted the potential synergies between what the UK is doing right now and what Brazil is about to do. So that's very encouraging. Also, I really welcome your comments on how you think adequacy determination should be approached in with a sense of mutuality and cooperative spirit, which is, I think the way forward to the extent adequacy is going to be used widely between countries. So yes, thank you very much for all these encouraging comments. We'll certainly be watching the UK because a lot of promising and hopeful initiatives are coming out of the UK right now on data flow. So we'll be watching that with interest, and I'm sure everybody on this panel will also. So thank you, Joe. And with that, I would like to move on to our next speaker, provocateur, Kate Charlotte from Google. Kate, welcome. And let me ask you a couple of questions. So considering Google's global scale and operations, what do you all at Google understand about cross-border data movement and data flows that might not be that obvious to a policy audience? And also, can you share your view on the global implications of restrictions on the free flow of data? And the last part of my question, are there any insights that you could share on the practical efforts that Google takes internally inside the company to manage global data flows? Over to you, Jude. Kate, sorry.
Thanks, Marcus. Yeah. And no problem. Good morning, everybody. I'm really glad to be here and honored to be part of the conversation and an impressive panel, as the other panelists have noted. Marcus, you asked about our global operations, so maybe I'll start by saying a word about global computing. In our view, global computing has big advantages. It's better for security. It increases access to innovation and services. It strengthens local economies. And so we, as Google, firmly believe that, as many participants have said, it's possible to preserve privacy while also enabling the cross-border data flows that support global computing. And that's done through strong legal and policy frameworks. In my experience, I'd say one of the major misunderstandings I've observed is the idea that restrictions on data flows create privacy or security benefits. The reality is that security and privacy don't depend on the location or the territory where data is processed, but really on the controls that are applied to that data, separate and irrespective from where the disks physically sit. So you can have movement of data across borders while maintaining strong protections. And actually, in many cases, data flows are very important to privacy and security and actively support better outcomes in those areas. Just an example, because that's very true at Google, we secure our data with world-class encryption, both in motion and at rest. We offer best-in-class user controls in our products, and those are protections that aren't dependent on where the data is stored or where it's processed. And just beyond those controls, our global computing infrastructure makes it easier to detect security threats in the network because it expands the signals that are available to the service provider when we're looking for those threats. Global networking also reduces the risk of outages or the loss of data due to damages or naturally occurring circumstances, because when you have these systems that are globally networked, they can stay online better in disruptive events, whether that's power outages or things that affect broad geographic areas. And that's because the traffic can be rerouted across the system. And by the way, it also offers 24/7 customer support, things along those lines. So there are things you actually lose when you disrupt global computing from a privacy and security perspective. I'd say the ability to move data across borders is also good, just, from a broader perspective for online services for everyone. Folks have talked about COVID already. This was very readily apparent as the world suddenly shifted millions of workers and students to online platforms. And of course, that shows the value of digital technologies, but it also shows how many of those technologies rely on cloud processing, whether that's Google Cloud or something else. They rely on that processing to change with the demands of the environments to keep the network secure. And if you have localized capabilities that don't have those kinds of protections, that's the kind of traffic that could have overwhelmed if you have a similar surge of all those people shifting shifting online. I think my second main point is that a legal system that supports the movement of data across borders, and others have made this point already as well, lets local companies access services at globally competitive prices. It enables local citizens to access innovative products from wherever they are in the world. And so in my view, this helps all kinds of economic sectors and company sizes, different parts of the global economy that rely on an open approach. And I've seen there's been some research as well that when organizations can't transfer data across borders, everyone starts to see the administrative costs build up that don't have as don't really have a strong or clear practical benefit. It increases operating costs by administrative overhead, might prevent businesses from taking advantage of global computing power, or they have less options for them to choose the services that meet their needs. I think it was a study by ITIC that showed data localization increases storage costs by 30 to 60%. And it ends up getting passed on to local companies and then, of course, to consumers in the form of higher fees and services. So some of the restrictions on data flows can disadvantage local businesses too. So anyways, our view is rather than try to restrict movement of data across borders, I know it's a common theme today, but policymakers should focus on facilitating data flows. And protecting data, in addition to that, can be done by data protection laws where the strong privacy and security standards can be set forward. And this can happen in trade agreements too. CIPL in the paper that we're talking about today outlines several mechanisms, helpfully in their paper. And LGPD does this, creates strong protections for individual data while giving a variety of different options for moving data. And then kind of to the last two presentations ago, we're very much a proponent of cross-border multilateral certification mechanisms like the APEC cross-border privacy rules. We think they do a good job of achieving privacy and the innovation that comes from data flows. And we think approaches like APEC have the real benefit of making it easier to create interoperable systems. That said, and we know policymakers and regulators need to create accountability and fulfill their mandate. And so we also think policymakers who are revising laws or guidance can create incentives to add technical protections for personal data. So just an example, we've invested a lot in developing privacy preserving technologies. A lot of other people are as well. But supporting the application of sophisticated privacy preserving protocols, whether that's differential privacy or federated learning or other capabilities, recognizes that these technologies can enhance privacy while really supporting innovation and growth. So I guess I'll close by saying, countries around the world, including Brazil, have an opportunity to lead by participating in those data flow frameworks. We really applaud Brazil's current approach to enabling those flows. The priority is taken in the DPA's regulatory agenda. It's leading across an approach across the region. And as part of that process, Brazil might want to consider opportunities to align with the APEC CBPR system I mentioned. Recognizing those certifications as a valid basis for transfer and processing, incentivize companies to invest there, reduces the cost of entering new markets for Brazilian companies, and of course, the focus of all this, maintaining the high standards and protection of fundamental rights. So thanks very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Kate. And I think you really did a great job summarizing and explaining concisely why data flows are so important, why global data flows are so important. It's important to remind ourselves the specifics, the specific examples of how data flows impact our ability to do business and to do the things we need to do, and if they stop, what we can't do. And I think you made a really strong case for it, and also for really nicely presented on some of the solutions, the technological solutions to protect privacy and to create trust in data flows, and some of the specific mechanisms that might be available. So thank you for that, Kate. This was really helpful. Let me move on to Jacobo Eshkenazi from HP. Jacobo, my questions to you relate to certifications and codes of conduct. I know you've thought a lot about certifications and codes of conduct in your role at HP. How can certifications and codes of conduct work as data transfer mechanisms? And should the ANPD be focusing on developing such mechanisms under the LGPD? And what are the opportunities and potential benefits for Brazil to take part in global data protection interoperability schemes, such as the APEC CBPR and also the APEC privacy recognition for processors, which are an aspect or part of or complementary to the CBPR? And we've already talked a little bit about the CBPR. Other speakers have mentioned them, but can you elaborate a little bit more on that issue? Over to you, Jacobo.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the invitation, Marcus and CIPL. It's great to be able to share this. If you want to flip to the next slide, in a way, this is both a very current topic but a very old discussion. And I wanted to highlight that we've been thinking about data transfers and the restrictions of data transfers probably since the dawn of the old European, not the regulation, the directive, and you know, throughout this time, laws have changed and they're ratcheting up, and data flow restrictions were about adequate levels of protections, but not in terms of legal regimes, but in preventing harm to data subjects. We've seen, and if you want to change the slide, we've seen a slow convergence happening, and a lot of countries are ratcheting up the level of protection to prevent harm to their users. This is done through new laws and through reforming laws, but also through reinterpreting existing laws through guidance. We have seen that in the cookie space, for instance, in the European Union. And we've seen the inclusion of accountability requirements. In a way, transfer mechanisms as codes of conduct and certifications are adequate, are the way in which companies demonstrate adequacy to operate. Differential compliers, which means that we are going to comply just to the level of the law in different countries, requires much more resources for a company. It requires constant monitoring of criteria by regulators. It requires a lot of manpower, and it's a waste of resources, frankly. So in a way, when you adhere to a code of conduct or you implement a certification, what you're doing is you're getting yourself as a company into an adequate level of protection that has to be higher, because you cannot, even if the law in a certain country is lower, you're still going to implement a global program. And this is the basis of why certifications and code of conduct make sense in a way. There are mechanisms for companies to establish and comply with principle-based approaches. I want to address the elephant in the room that, you know, this certifications and codes of conduct are not going to bring a solution to government access to data, which seems to be the topic lately, but they're a very valuable mechanism in terms of what companies can do. You wanna change to the next slide, please. So around 2009, we started discussing how to use mechanisms as BCRs and CBPRs, and we've been talking about it for a long time. And I certainly, BCRs are gold standards, and CBPRs and PRPs or privacy recognition for processors are very good mechanisms. They're very, very robust mechanisms to be used, but perhaps they need, in order to be able to talk to each other and have this interoperability, could be bridged by the use of codes of conduct and certifications. Because getting a BCR it's as complex in terms of time and effort as an adequacy is in terms of discussions. We've spent probably 300 hours on our BCRCs and BCRPs. And if I were to try to replicate that and do a BCR with every country that has data flow restrictions, it would be impossible to achieve. We're currently doing our UK BCRs, and even though we are just transferring a mechanism that was already recognized by the ICO, it's taking a substantial amount of time to spend in updating that and creating a UK BCR. So in a way, getting to a code of conduct, and you want to advance the slide, is the next iteration of this process, where we have the BCR Plus and the UK BCRs, and we have our APEC certification that we as a company achieved, but we have to have a conversation about how to incorporate those same controls, an agreed controls framework, into a code of conduct or a certification that can be globally attainable. And I was delighted to see the slide that was presented by Asai-san, where we are recognizing the different frameworks around the world. And I think that we need to have a discussion on a controls framework where companies can get to that. So, you know, what the benefit is to implement a program globally that is consistent. I want to address the second question, Marcus, which is, should the NDP focus developing these mechanisms? And the short answer is, because of the voluntary nature of these frameworks, you need to create a critical mass of participants, and that is very hard. So I wanted to bring two different experiences that I've been involved with for a very long time. One from Singapore. Singapore started their certification mechanism, their Trustmark certification in 2013. And to date, in 2021, I went yesterday to their website, they have 52 certified companies. When a certification is, or a code of conduct is not recognized internationally, it doesn't have this, it doesn't travel from one to another country, the value diminishes. And I have to spend the same amount of time getting this certification as I have to do it in another country. If you go to this next slide, another example is Mexico. Mexico launched a very robust program about certifications and codes of conduct in 2015. And unfortunately, the registry that they have wasn't, I wasn't able to get numbers online, but my understanding is that uptake has been very slow, and they don't have a very big critical mass. So, you know, one of the things that Singapore has done recently is to go from those very local certifications that they had and recognize APEC, CBPRs, and PRPs and participate there. So maybe that's an approach, and that's what I would like to talk about. What are the opportunities for Brazil to do, and how to leapfrog in a way? So short term, I think that Brazil could take an approach in which they would approve or recognize existing certifications. Either the UK BCRs, the EU BCRs, CBPRs. There's a precedent where Bermuda just recognized CBPRs, although they're not part of that mechanism. Or just, you know, say we'll take the PDPC and we take INAI. That in itself will create a critical mass of companies that are adequate for the Brazil law. Again, you have to do the sums and look at what those certifications are those enough to meet the requirements of the LGPD. But I would advance that if they don't get you 100%, they will get you 95% there. And on a medium-term opportunity, there is a space to have conversations at the regional level and at the global level, both in WEF, at the OECD, have conversations with the ICO in DMC and the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport from the UK, have conversations with the European Union, have conversations with with APEC. I understand, and it has been publicly said by members of APEC, that they are looking, they have expressed interest in opening up to non-APEC authorities. And I remember that Colombia participated in meetings a while ago. The European Union has been a participant in meetings in APEC. So I think that there is space to do that. Also, Brazil has participated actively in the Ibero-American network for data protection, and there is no regional agreement in the Americas. So I think that having conversations at that level could be a midterm opportunities, but always have a view of having interoperability as the threat here. What I would advise in terms of experience is to stay away from conformity assessment-based certifications. They don't work. They are very complex, very costly, and even big companies who can achieve them can only do it on a limited scope. It's not worth it. I think that going through mechanisms like Apex is the best bet to get a critical mass, and realize that Brazil's size and regulation approach positions Brazil well to drive this type of discussions. And I'll leave it there for now, unless there's questions.
Great, thank you so much, Jacobo. I think you really made a very strong case for rationalizing and streamlining global data transfer mechanisms through interoperability, or even a more globalized mechanism in itself, like globalizing the CBPR, for example, the strong need for that. You have a lot of experience in this field. As I mentioned, you've been a leader in discussing and thinking about these issues for the past many years during your career in this field. So thank you very much. And I think I recommend you as a resource to everybody on this call as they think further about these issues, and to really think about the practical implications of the various transfer mechanisms and how to rationalize and streamline them and globalize them. So we are out of time, but we have one more speaker that we really want to hear from. So our last speaker, Vanessa Butella, could not make it today. So we have Marcel Leonardi, and we really want to hear from him. So I'm going to ask Marcel my question and ask him to be short. And then I'm not clear whether we have time for a few questions, but if you have questions, put them in the Q&A anyway, and then I'll check with Giovanna if we have time for any questions to the panelists, or if we need to wrap up. So Marcel, thank you for waiting patiently until the very end. My questions for you relate to what Brazilian organizations should do now at this point in time, given the fact that the ANPD has not yet issued detailed guidance and rules on cross-border data transfers. What can companies do now in Brazil that's practical, that makes sense, and that complies with the LGPD, pending any future guidance from the ANPD? What's your advice?
Thanks, Marcus. So the usual questions that we get, we tend to advise very large companies, Fortune 500 companies and companies like that. The interplay usually goes as follows. So Marcel, we'd like to be compliant with international transfers and LGPD. So where's the adequacy list? It doesn't exist. Okay, where are your SCCs? They haven't been drafted yet. Okay, can we use our BCRs? No, you need to go with the approval from the ANPD. Can they do that? No, they don't have a process for that yet. Okay, so what are we supposed to do? Well, what most companies are doing these days, in the absence of any transfer mechanisms that can actually be implemented despite existing in the law, is pretty much saying, look, we need to be transparent about the fact that international transfers are taking place. So they put that in their privacy policies, and basically they rely on the Article 13, number 9 of LGPD, which states that you can do as a mechanism for transfers, essentially when you need to be to do a transfer because you have a contractual necessity for compliance with a legal obligation or something of the sort. So I was very delighted to hear Miriam mentioning that SCCs are a priority for the ANPD, because The entire market is waiting for that. Essentially, there's no way to be complied with international transfers as of today because these transfer mechanisms haven't really been implemented, and there's no process within the ANPD to approve any of the traditional mechanisms. Again, there's no way to tell them, look at my BCRs, what do you think of them? Well, we don't have a process for approval yet. Well, can we use our SCCs? No, you cannot because they don't exist. So can we rely on adequacy? No. We even had clients from the US when Privacy Shield was actually working, something to the effect, can we do a triangulation thing? And I asked them, what do you mean by that? Well, if we are Privacy Shield certified, it means that we comply with the GDPR standards. So couldn't ANPD state that by triangulation, we are also in compliance with the Brazilian law because it's very similar to what the GDPR states? And the answer is no. We're talking about flows from Brazil to outside of Brazil. So Marcos, in a nutshell, and I know we have very limited time, I think that what should be a priority for local companies is to keep engaging with the ANPD and try to showcase how important it is for them to expedite the process of SCCs or pretty much any other valid transfer mechanism. Because again, as it stands, companies ask every single day what they can do to be compliant. They want to be compliant, but there is no framework in place for them to do so. So that would be my contribution in a very, very nutshell.
Okay. Well, thank you, Marcel. Thank you for your brevity. There's so much to talk about, and I think it's good to hear that you have given so much thought to this and already have so much experience with these issues and are talking to the ANPD. And there's a lot to do for all of you in Brazil to sort this out, and I think you are totally on top of it. But it's we need to wrap up this discussion for today. I had other questions for all of you. It feels like we just started to discuss the issue. I want to put one question to the entire panel that has been asked, and maybe start with Miriam, if that would be possible. And the question is, what do you think about the possibility of a global international treaty on in data protection generally? That also covers data transfers, but a global treaty on data protection. I think that's somebody wanted us to put that to the panel. If there's anybody who would like to opine on that, maybe starting with Miriam, that would be great. And that'll be the last question if you keep your answer very short, and then we have to wrap up.
Sure, I think it's a great question. And the funny thing is we were discussing this yesterday at ANPD. If, in 5 or 10 or 20 years time, we will have a global treaty with, interoperable mechanisms to which all countries will adapt. I don't know. I think we are at this point looking for compatibility between different models. And I hope we do make progress in finding more interoperability. But I don't know if we will have a global treaty anytime soon. I think it would be wonderful. But, there are many challenges.
Well said. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that? I mean, my personal thought is, again, I mean, since data flows are global, it would make sense to have a global solution. There are many different, ways to attack that problem, and it's happening in the OECD and other places, and people are working on it, but it's going to take a while to actually have one true global solution here. But I think that should be sort of the goal, because that would then mirror the facts on the ground, which is data flows are global and have to be global. So it's always good to have an aspirational goal like that.
Marcos,
yes.
I think that in order for that to happen, we need to separate the conversation into two aspects. One is there's certainly a conversation that needs to happen that is government to government about government access to data. Yeah. And I'm encouraged about the discussions in the OECD around that topic, because that is not something that companies are going to be able to figure out. Even if we want, we have to comply with the law wherever we operate. And the other one is about having a controls framework that is common, or at least that has a common denominator, a floor where we can agree upon. And I think that's doable. But that's doable, and it has to incorporate the opinions of companies and of regulators as well. And I think that we're going to get there probably in 5 to 10 years. But the other side needs to be separate, because if we mix them together, we're never going to resolve this.
Yeah, I totally agree, Jacobo. That's an important point. Any other final comments? If not, I'm going to wrap up this panel now. Thank you so much to all the panelists for your time today, and especially Commissioner Asai and anybody else who might have been in a time zone like that for staying up so late and to sticking with us and participating. This was truly productive from my perspective. So thank you all very much. And I'm handing it over back to Giovanna now.
Thank you, Marcus, very much. And thank you all. I'm really sorry. Thank you all for speaking at the panel. And now we're going to have Ana Paula Bialy, please, joining us to moderate the next panel on data breaches.
Giovana, muito obrigada pela oportunidade. Agradeço a CIPL e ao IDP pela oportunidade de mediar esse próximo painel num assunto tão interessante, tão atual como essa questão dos vazamentos, né, dos incidentes de segurança, que parece que conforme nós estamos passando pelo período da pandemia e cada vez mais digitais, eles ficaram mais presentes nas nossas rotinas. Nós vamos ter um painel com a presença do diretor da NPD, Joacil, e aqui aproveito para agradecer em nome do diretor Joacil a todos os diretores da NPD que realmente têm engajado nesse projeto e feito uma participação e interação incrível aqui no evento. O David Stevens, que é o chairman da DPA belga, Bridget Tracy, que é do escritório Hunton e tem uma experiência enorme com esse processo todo de reportar incidentes de segurança e quais os critérios que têm que ser considerados. A Flávia Mitre, uma superstar de privacy responsável pelo assunto no Uber, a Marie Olson, que também é responsável pelo assunto na Boeing, Nicolas Andrade do Zoom e a Christine Hoppers, depois para fechar o nosso painel com uma versão do CERT-NIC BR. Já apresentando a todos e sem apresentar um currículo maior, até porque todos já são muito conhecidos desse grupo. Gostaria de trazer rapidamente aqui o destaque da contribuição da CIPL à tomada de subsídios que a ANPD iniciou e já aproveitando a levantar a tomada de subsídios para provocar o diretor Joacil a respeito de como é que a ANPD recebeu os vários comentários que foram levados, se isso já foi discutido, se a autoridade caminha já para uma definição de como serão os contornos para comunicação de incidentes de segurança no Brasil. A CIPL trabalha muito a mensagem do accountability, né, da gestão de risco, da prestação de contas com transparência para uma efetiva aplicação da legislação de proteção de dados. Então, acho que a grande curiosidade que vem é quais os contornos que a ANPD pretende dar a essa normatização para verificar até se estamos seguindo esse caminho orientativo da CIPL. O diretor Joacil, muito obrigada. O senhor tem a palavra. Por 5 minutos, por favor. Acho que ainda está no mudo.
Um dia a gente aprende. Inicialmente, cumprimento a Ana e os demais presentes, desejando que boa tarde, boa noite, bom dia aqui já não vale mais. E parabenizo a organização desse evento de alto nível. Agradeço o convite pela oportunidade de conversar sobre incidentes de segurança e a sua forma de comunicação. E conversar com tanta gente altamente capacitada, isso também é bom. Acredito que, neste momento, a gente pode dizer que o incidente foi o assunto mais abordado aqui na NPD. Muito em função dos vazamentos de dados que ocorreram nesse início de ano. Parece que quando a gente nascemos aqui, há cerca de 6 meses, que com algum efetivo aqui, 6 meses, resolveram divulgar os vazamentos. E isso aí tornou o tema muito atual para a gente. A LGPD recebeu nos últimos meses, e a gente só tem últimos meses mesmo, cerca de 40 comunicados de incidente. Mas isso é indevido, e houve muita polêmica também sobre esse tema, mas mesmo antes das polêmicas envolvendo os vazamentos de dados, a autoridade mapeou a necessidade de atuação regulatória e publicou, em 27 de janeiro, a agenda regulatória, onde já previu o tratamento desse assunto, a abordagem desse assunto, começando nesse semestre. E assim estamos fazendo. Foi uma das prioridades, existiam muitas outras, mas essa aí foi fundamental. Os riscos referentes aos incidentes têm uma grande abrangência, pois pode afetar indivíduos ou uma grande parcela da sociedade. Isto é, o potencial de danos pode ser individual ou coletivo. Todos sabemos o que é um incidente de segurança, mas vale lembrar que incidentes podem ser conceituados como qualquer evento adverso que possa trazer risco ou suspeita de risco aos dados e, por consequência, às pessoas. Por trás de cada dado existem pessoas. O incidente pode ser voluntário, pode ser acidental, por imperícia, imprudência ou negligência, pode ter origem interna ou externa a uma organização, pode afetar dados sensíveis ou não, pode afetar dados classificados ou não, pode causar danos tangíveis ou não. Um dado, mesmo que ostensivo, dependendo do contexto, pode ser extremamente relevante. Então, a preocupação com o dado tem que existir sempre. O zelo com o dado tem que existir sempre. Há incidentes que são verdadeiros acidentes, que são aqueles que a gente não consegue prever. Bom, diante da grande variedade e dos diferentes contextos e tipos de incidentes, a NPD decidiu lançar a tomada de subsídios. Lançamos essa tomada e antecedendo essa tomada, uma documentação referente à orientação sobre o assunto e um formulário para preenchimento. Tivemos uma resposta da sociedade muito positiva, tanto em quantidade quanto em relevância. Recebemos aproximadamente contribuições de 150 entidades da sociedade civil, do setor empresarial, setor acadêmico e contribuições individuais também. Tem muita gente envolvida, tem muita gente interessada. Isso aí motiva, eu acho que motiva quem já está, sabe que não está sozinho. Estamos com cerca de 1.244 páginas para ser estudada, analisada e aproveitar e tentar conciliar convergências, posições e dúvidas que foram apresentadas. É um trabalho meio grande que estamos, vamos dizer, temos que realizar agora. Eu acho que o meu tempo está quase no final. A Autoridade Nacional tem trabalhado para contribuir com um caminho cooperativo com outras autoridades, a partir do compartilhamento de informações sobre os processos existentes e as novas técnicas e metodologias também que são utilizadas. Bom, eu já estou finalizando, então eu vou aproveitar para agradecer Eu quero agradecer a colaboração que nós temos recebido. Nós temos recebido cooperação e experiência, comunicado de experiência, de vivência, de muitas autoridades de proteção de dados, principalmente da comunidade europeia, do Reino Unido, da França, da Portugal, Itália, Holanda, Bélgica, Espanha. É muito bom saber que todo mundo quer contribuir e nós estamos recebendo as contribuições e muito satisfeitos com o que estamos recebendo. Eu acho que terminou meu tempo, foi isso? Bom, então acho que terminou meu tempo. Acho que ainda teria alguma vontade para falar, mas encerro dizendo que é muito bom e considero muito positivo, até mesmo impressionante, o idealismo não só das instituições, que são compostas de pessoas, então o idealismo das pessoas, que estão praticamente respirando essa vontade de contribuir para um mundo melhor. E o nosso mundo é este. Nem tudo é perfeito e nunca será perfeito, mas, se possível, vamos trabalhar para melhorar, para colaborar, para ter um mundo melhor. Obrigado.
Muito obrigada, diretor Joacil, pelas palavras inspiradoras. E acho que, sem dúvida nenhuma, no universo da proteção de dados, a gente vê muita paixão. As pessoas abraçam a proteção de dados e realmente se envolvem e cooperam muito. E eu fico muito feliz de saber que a autoridade está, de fato, engajando e trocando experiências e tendo oportunidade com o diálogo com tantas outras autoridades mundo afora, pois, de fato, a gente não consegue olhar para a temática da proteção de dados de uma maneira individual, né? Existe um aspecto global, um aspecto de necessidade de interoperabilidade. Então, eu realmente recebo com muita alegria esse comentário de saber que a NPD já está tão engajada nesse diálogo. E aproveito a sua fala para convidar para falar o senhor Stevens David, que é o chairman da autoridade belga. E a gente tem uma questão interessante. O senhor mencionou que né, o incidente de segurança é algo que todo mundo sabe o que é, ele engloba qualquer evento adverso. E nós temos, na nossa legislação, a referência a incidente de segurança, a um security incident, mas a gente tem na GDPR uma referência a data breach e muita discussão em termos de será que esses conceitos são diferentes e deveriam ser esclarecidos como diferentes pela ANPD. Então, eu trago um pouco desse contexto para o Stevens e a pergunta de como é que tem sido a experiência da autoridade belga em termos de volume de notificações, se uma vez que a GDPR entrou em vigor, se esse volume cresceu de uma maneira substancial, porque os agentes de tratamento ficam com medo e acabam levando qualquer caso para a autoridade. Se esse é o caso, quais são os critérios que têm sido utilizados para procurar domar um pouco esse volume e qual tem sido a experiência, os desafios e as lições aprendidas desses praticamente 3 anos da vigência da GDPR. Muito obrigada por sua participação no evento.
Okay, thank you very much. I guess that was the invitation to start to speak, but then in a language which unfortunately I do not understand. So sorry for that.
I do apologize. I understood you were having simultaneous translation.
I understood Belgica and things like that, and I understand my own name, so that will work just fine, no problem. I have a couple of issues or things I wanted to mention is about something about the volume of data breach notifications since the GDPR, and then also a little bit what are the challenges and what are the lessons that we learned, because we do this now since GDPR, so about 2 years now, 3 years, and what are the important lessons which I can share with the colleagues from, I would say, around the world, and Brazil in particular. So in Belgium, we had a growing number of data breach notifications. In 2018, there were 450 around. In 2019, it was almost doubled to 900. And for 2020, we have 1,200 data breach notifications. That figure is not really very high. Just as a comparison, if I look at figures in a report from or a European report, I see in the same period, Germany had 77,000 data breach notifications. The Netherlands, 66,000. The United Kingdom, 30,000. Denmark, 18,000, and Ireland, 17,000. So if I would extrapolate it, that would mean that we should have had 15,000, while in total we had 2,500. So it's, I think, fair to say that we didn't have huge numbers of data breach notifications yet. One of the reasons is, without any doubt, that some of the European countries already had a data breach notification or obligation before GDPR. We didn't. We only had an obligation to notify telecom data leakage, and so the market players didn't have the habit of, or didn't maybe know what a data breach was, and didn't have the habit to notify it. But we're on the way, I would say. So that's the first point. In Belgium, we have, well, 1,200 this year, so about 100 every month. So about, I think, 5 every working day notifications, which is for a country like ours with 11 million inhabitants, not so high. If I would say, what is the biggest challenge if you are starting with a data breach notification regime or obligation, and I forgot to thank the organizers for providing me the opportunity to share my knowledge with you, so I'll do it here. Thank you. But what I think is the biggest challenge is turning it into a sensible instrument of privacy protection, because in the end, we are the regulator, we want to protect citizens. And how can a data breach notification contribute to protecting citizens? I think that is the challenge, turning a notification regime into a useful instrument, not only for the regulator itself, because it is useful, I'll come back to it, but also for increasing the protection of citizens, because that's what we are here for. And so my lessons or suggestions or advice, which you asked me, are double. I have 3 suggestions from a more organizational point of view. How do you do it? And 3, I would say, more material lessons or advices or to share with you. I'll start with the organizational one. I think as a regulator, you need to prepare for a big volume. Even though in Belgium, 1,200 seems not high, but if you have to look at 1,200 cases manually, that takes already quite some time. So, and again, 1,200 is not a lot. You can also have 77,000 if you're Germany, or 66 if you're the Netherlands. So 66,000 for the Netherlands, which is not that much bigger as we are. That could be the figure which you end up with in Brazil. So prepare for a big volume. I think you need to think about an online or an automated system. You need probably some intelligence for filtering these different notifications, because, of course, there is well, notifications which are interesting from a regulator's point of view, and there's notifications which are not at all interesting. I'll come back to that later too. I think when you do, the important thing to think about too is think about criteria for filtering. It might be how many data subjects are there involved. It might be what type of data is involved. It might be the duration of the leak. It might be, has the leak already been closed? So think about how you will make the distinction between important notifications and, I would say, well, non-important stuff. So that's all with regard to volume. I think you also need to be aware in many cases, or you need to take into account if whatever procedure you develop, to take into account that is in some cases, especially if it's really important, urgency is always around. Because of the impact it might have. Material cases will have an impact on the protection of citizens, and therefore it might lead to urgency. It might be urgent because a public authority has been compromised through phishing or through hacking or whatever, but there's always the air of urgency around, and especially, and that relates to the third point, especially because when it becomes public, I think the third, what I would say organizational lesson is there is also not only an urgency, but there is also a public communication aspect. Take into account that communicating appropriately towards the public at large through your press officer or whatever is also very important. So the combination of volume, urgency, and the communication aspect, I think, are three important advices that I can give. I think maybe developing on that one, I think it's also useful to try to connect with other institutions which exist. For in Belgium, for example, we have a cybersecurity center, which are experts in cybersecurity. It's interesting to on beforehand establish the contacts with them so that at least all the public authorities are in sync or saying the same thing. One last advice with regard to communication: be very careful, because before you know, you make things worse, and even or you present or citizens think that it's worse than it actually is. So communicate only what you really know, and don't go how shall I say, fantasizing about what could have happened and what the potential impact could be, because citizens only hear what the worst case is when we communicate as a regulator. So be very factual. Don't make it worse. Stick to confirmed facts, and facts which are not confidential or hindering the official inquiries, because there might be criminal inquiries and so on, or inquiries by your own authority or by other authorities. That's the three organizational lessons I think we'll have learned. The three more material aspects, and then I wrap up, is I think you also, at least for us, it was a challenge to avoid red tape. What you don't want is to impose or to get notifications for stolen laptops. The most telling example which comes to my mind is we once got a notification from I think the Belgian train company, but don't quote me on that, or a lawyer association, I don't remember. But they notified that one of the laptops of the employees was stolen on an international train, and they notified that that was an international data breach. And so if that were really true, we would have to sync with our other European colleagues, an international, so we would immediately be talking about the breach with 26 different European regulatory authorities. It would have been the Tower of Babylon, I guess. And in the notification, we saw that the laptop was actually encrypted and appropriately protected, but nevertheless, it was stolen. It was stolen, and it was reported as a data breach. That's the kind of thing you don't want in your notification, because you can't do anything with it. And before you know, you are considering a stolen encrypted laptop, which is probably just stolen, and it could be otherwise, of course, but stolen for the laptop itself and not for the information, as an international data breach, and you're looking into it with 26 regulators. We are not in this game for ourselves. We are here to protect citizens. There was no indication that it was a serious intentional stealing of that information of that laptop. So avoid red tape, avoid, I would say, over notification. And I think the objective of for my authority, it's what I always ask from the people looking into the data breach notifications is try to learn where we can provide indications on how to improve, for example, security levels. A very practical example, we still get daily notifications for phishing or hacking of email accounts? Well, I'm very close to establishing as a rule or as a guideline, if you use email in a professional way, you at least need two-factor authentication to avoid this kind of stuff. So try to learn from the notifications. Consider the notifications also as interesting input into your, I would say, regulatory practice. Second, and I've touched upon it maybe a little bit already, foresee a learning curve. It's not so easy to do that because you get 1,000 or 70,000 notifications. It's not so easy to distinguish which ones are important and which ones are not important, which ones you can learn something from and you can yourself, or you can educate, I would say, the external world, the market players on how to deal with information more appropriately. So foresee a learning curve. You won't be able to do that from day one, both in resources and in time. There will be some learning curve ahead. The filtering out and the following up of important notifications, it just doesn't happen from day one. And finally, I think, and that's maybe my most important one, because I often see the opposite, I would say, tendency. Numbers in this case are irrelevant, I would say. It's not because you notify a lot of data breaches that you have leaking security. I would say to the contrary. Companies or hospitals or whatever institutions not notifying data breach, that is very unlikely. That is suspicious. Notifying should be, how should I say, notifying is for me more an indicator of maturity. At least you think you know that what a data breach is. If you're not notifying, it is highly unlikely that in the hospital, if you have a couple of thousands of doctors or hundreds of doctors, that nothing leaks during a year. So the high volume, the high number is a very bad, the number itself is a very bad indicator of the level of maturity with regard to data protection or physical protection of information. And I see very often the tendency to do otherwise. We look at the notifications and we say, well, this is suspicious. There's always the same bank. And there is a tendency to go and say, hey, bank, what's going wrong? But stick to, or keep in mind, I think non-notification is a better or lower numbers of notification compared, I mean, not comparing an SME with an international bank, of course, but lower levels of notification is usually an indicator of the fact that they don't know what a data breach is, or that they don't have the processes in place to pick it up, or let alone to notify it. So numbers might be a bad proxy to rely upon how serious the issue is. That's my third, I would say, material lesson. And if that's okay, I'll stick it to that. Thank you.
David, thank you so much for sharing all your experience with us, and I truly think some very helpful tips for the Brazilian authority to, as they start looking on how to implement that. And I know we are pressured on time, but quick curiosity. You mentioned that so in 3 years you've had 1,200 reports. What is the size of the DPA in terms of people to handle that?
Sorry, we have 1,200 this year. So in total, the digit was growing, the number was growing. In total, in the period which I talked about, the total is about 2,500. But okay, double. Not again, the figures are not that important. So Belgium inhabitants. Belgium is a small European country, of course, and has a small number of inhabitants, 11 million. We are with 70 people in total, but I would say 20 or 20, around 1/3 is more supporting staff, not dealing with cases. So let's say that we have about 40, 50 people working at the Data Protection Authority from a material point of view. Okay, and actually, one person is really fully full-time dedicated on handling these cases. But of course, there's help from colleagues from time to time. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And I think it goes to reinforcing the importance of having some sort of automation to ensure that the process is actually effective. Be responsible, but don't overreact on both sides, I guess, controllers as well as the regulators. Thank you so much for your input. And Bridget, we're going on to you to help us have a little bit of a view of being on the other side, I guess, and having to report data breaches and global incidents. I think this example of the train is very good. And when we are actually responsible for those, we do tend to overreact and say, well, let me be on the side of caution, but maybe, as David mentioned, this is not necessarily the best outcome. So it would be great to hear your experience. And if we can try to stick to 5 minutes so everyone has a chance to contribute.
Yes, I will. Thank you very much, Anna. And thank you to my colleagues at CIPL and all those involved in organising this really wonderful 2 days of discussion. It's a real pleasure to be with you. So I want to just really start with a point that one of the speakers made yesterday. Caroline Nouveau from MasterCard said that breaches are an inevitability, and we need to focus on ensuring that organisations actually know how to respond to a breach. And it sort of mirrors a comment that David Stevens made just now. It's almost suspicious if companies don't report breaches, because it suggests that their program is not very mature and they don't recognise that they've actually got a problem. And I think this is a really key area in which regulators can assist organisations with guidance. And one of the sort of issues that we see, and we've dealt with many hundreds of breaches over the years, including some really very large global breach incidents. And what we've concluded is that while breach prevention is obviously very important, it's not enough. And in fact, what we tend to focus on with our clients is we call it breach preparedness, and also breach response. And so the first question that I've been asked to look at or to address is, what are the biggest challenges that organizations face when dealing with a data breach? And I would say the first issue that comes up time and time again is actually discovering the issue. It might sound odd, but even with big breaches, it can take a while for an organization to realize that there's been an incident. Sometimes, and actually quite more than you would think, our clients are actually informed about an incident by somebody else. So it's either the threat actor in the case of a ransomware attack, or perhaps some of these researchers that scour the dark web looking for caches of data, might be law enforcement, or sometimes customers. So the company itself doesn't recognize a breach, somebody else tells them. And the reason I raise this is because this is really relevant. The way in which an issue comes to light can really have a material bearing on how it's played out in the public domain. Not just in relation to the decision about whether you report to the regulator or whether you tell individuals that a breach has occurred, but actually the whole sort of complexity of dealing with the breach incident is very different when a number of facts, not necessarily facts in inverted commas, are out there in the public domain. And this also impacts on how well the company is judged to have handled the issue and how supportive sometimes the regulator is perceived to have been. And so in addition to sort of trying to scramble and understand what has happened, to determine who's been impacted, to determine how to contain the incident, when a breach is out there in the public domain, sometimes before the organization hears of it, there can be a real clamor for information. And I think if that's not handled well, then I think there can be a distraction, and organizations are unable to focus adequately on actually containing the incident and making sure that they're working to minimize or to mitigate the risk for individuals. So that's the first point. The second point I wanted to make is that it's also interesting just to think about how organizations are informed sort of through the internal channels of the fact that an incident has occurred. And there are some really key determinants that affect whether or not an organization is going to receive this sort of intelligence from the ground, if you like. Organizations need to develop a breach reporting mechanism that encourages staff members to report incidents. They need to be willing to tell, they need to know who to tell, and they need to know how to escalate. And I think, again, the way in which the regulator frames the breach issue and the reporting obligation can actually have a material impact on just how organizations really address that issue internally. So it's important that organizations have breach reporting mechanisms that capture the right types of incidents and that are accessible to and known about by everybody within the organization. So it's important that everyone knows how to report an issue. Then I would also just add to this sort of catalogue, another challenge organizations face is actually activating their breach response team quickly. And this again might be surprising, but often companies don't have very good breach response procedures. They might have a written procedure because that enables them to tick a box, but actually it might be out of date, it might have been copied or borrowed from someone else. They might not have rehearsed it. So there are lots of things about the breach reporting procedure that may not work, even though there's a piece of paper that they can wave around. The third challenge I want to mention is the challenge when a breach arises, the challenge of determining which law applies and how that impacts decisions about who to notify. And this can be very complex. And we do deal with a lot of breaches that have a global dimension with individuals all over the globe. Sometimes more than one legal entity might be impacted as well. And so there can be some really difficult issues to work through to determine who needs to be told and within what time frame. And then the final point I wanted to mention amongst the challenges is this whole issue of determining whether or not to notify the regulator or individuals. And from a European perspective, the time frame for notification is 72 hours, which is obviously very short. And often organizations don't know very much at that point. So one sort of aspect of our reporting, at least here in the UK, which is very helpful, is that the regulator does expect that 72-hour window to be met, but they're not expecting a very detailed explanation of the incident at that point. They need to understand generally the order of magnitude, the nature of the risk, and they want to know what the organization is doing to address the issue that's arisen. And I just want to pick up on a comment that David made earlier too. So this decision about whether to notify and whether over notification is becoming a feature of our regimes in Europe and in the UK. So the decision as to whether to notify the regulator is a risk-based decision, but the threshold is really low. So you need to notify unless the breach is unlikely to result in a risk to individuals. And David talked about the laptop example, which he frankly wouldn't want to know about. But because the sanctions for failing to notify within the deadline are potentially quite high, this has led to significant over-notification, including in the UK. And many companies just simply don't want to take the risk of failing to notify, nor do they want to report late. And as a telling kind of indication, or perhaps sort of proof of this, in the most recent report published by the Information Commissioner's Office, our regulator here, 95% of the reported breaches did not result in any remedial action on the part of the data controller, which suggests there's been a huge amount of over-notification of issues that perhaps didn't need to be brought to the regulator's attention. So, Anna, I'm conscious of the fact that I don't have much time, and I can see you nodding. Would you like me to wrap up there? Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much. I hope that that's helpful to give you insight of the kinds of challenges that organizations are facing. And some of them are not necessarily the obvious ones, but I hope I've given you some sense too of how the regulators' approach to managing breaches and their expressing their expectations for notification can actually have a material impact on whether or not companies notify.
Bridget, thank you so much for your insights, and you did bring some excellent points to the conversation. The one I would like to stress a little bit is the idea or the concept that in the EU, you need to notify within 72 hours. And as we are working in our on regulation, this is a big discussion because our law doesn't foresee the 72 hours. It says within a reasonable time. And because of the lack of maturity overall with the whole concept of a legislation around protection of personal data, the learning curve might be a little bit more steep than it was in the EU, which brings additional challenges from an implementation standpoint. And I will already raise this, and since companies are going to talk now, it would be interesting to understand a little bit the challenges around this time frame as well. And I also think it's an important takeaway that you mentioned, which is the fact that the notification doesn't need to be complete. It's not that full report on what happened, but it's just, this happened, I'm looking into it, this is what I have right now, but then it triggers a process. It's not, and I think we tend to look at that as being, I need to give everything to the regulator immediately. So it's important to have guidance from the regulator that this is not the case, and also understanding what is this minimum threshold that should be there, both in terms of triggering and of satisfying the legal requirement. Thank you so much for your insights. And with that, I'll turn over to Flavia and ask Flavia, what has been your experience at Uber in terms of the process that the organization has been putting in place to prevent and to manage data breaches, looking at the Brazilian law. Thank you, Flavia.
Okay, thank you for the invitation for me to be here today. It's always an honor also to be with Ana, who I admire a lot. So giving you guys a little bit of flavor on what Uber has done and how we've structured ourselves in order to respond and comply with the local requirements that vary significantly. So taking a little step back, I want to share that we were able to build up a very structured process to comply with the various data breach notifications that are imposed on us within a very short time frame. I joined Uber in 2017. When I joined, there was no process in place. Every time that we had a vulnerability or an incident, it was a horror show because nobody knew who had to be involved. We were doing all the analysis while the incident was happening, and that is the worst situation that a data controller or a data processor wants to be in. So after we made a lot of mistakes, we finally got our act together, and we've built a very strong privacy and security compliance program. So the first thing that we did is build a security incident response plan and a privacy incident response plan. These are very, very complete. They're tied up with our data mapping, so we're very sure of all the different types of personal data that we hold on behalf of our users. I think we're lucky in the sense that we do not process any sort of sensitive data, at least for the operations that we have now. It might change in the future, but we currently don't. And when a vulnerability happens, there's a team that is always on call 24/7, 365 days a year, that identifies what the issue was. And then we are able to map out in a also very tight time frame which jurisdiction it has affected. And both our security incident response plan and our privacy incident response plan already carry the provisions for each jurisdiction in which we operate in. I think Uber has a challenge that in spite of our data controllers not being based in Latin America, for purpose of Latin America, our data controller is UTI, the US-based company. We do have local entities that are established and they operate in all countries that we have our business in. So we do have a local entity based in Brazil, Chile, Argentina, so on and so forth. And we do not take the argument that because the data controller is not based in the country, we do not have to comply with local regulations. We've done that in the past, and it was not a friendly conversation with Data Protection Authority. So we changed that. And today we comply with all local regulations. So there's a team that is already predefined per jurisdiction that is involved every time an incident occurs. It doesn't matter day, night, holiday, doesn't really matter. And that team then leads the strategy for notification for that country where it was affected. I think the greatest challenge that exists on this is that there is no consistency on notification requirements and the deadlines around the world. I would love if for us in Latin America, we could have something similar to GDPR. I think that would make lives of people like me much easier, because in Europe, although you have different forms and different processes to notify regulators there, at least the deadline is the same. And I think that makes things a little bit easier. For us in LATAM, it's not easy at all. And what we do is Uber also learned the very hard lesson, which is related to mistrust of our users when we do not come forward and we are not transparent whenever an incident occurs. So we do comply with reporting to the Data Protection Authority only when it is required by law. So it's, to not say that we've never done that, I think we only did once a voluntary data reporting to incident reporting to the Data Protection Authority. But we do significant voluntary notices to data subjects, even when we understand that that would not be required by law, but we want to really be super transparent and have people be informed of if something happened with their data. I also think that the complexity on navigating this, when you were talking about a multi-jurisdiction incident, is to understand what would trigger the notification requirement per country. And in Latin America, each one does its own thing. LGPD has its very unique set of provisions, and I think it has the added challenge that it does require for a notice to the Data Protection Authority and to the data subject, and it does not indicate a different time frame for both. On our experience, we know that a Data Protection Authority can be notified with a shorter notice. And I also think, with all the respect, I mentioned this, but I do think that the Brazilian Data Protection Authority needs to specify a little bit better how companies can notify them and how they can conduct a notice to comply with the immediate deadline, but that it will be unlikely for a company to have everything that is required on Article 48 within 72, it doesn't even mention the 72-hour period. It indicates that the DPA will provide for a reasonable time frame for notifying. But we know, people who have handled incidents before, that sometimes you don't have all the information within 72 hours. So it's important to have a process that you can notify to comply with the deadline while you're still gathering the further information to fully comply with the requirement. And I think that when an incident is happening, the most important things is to contain it. And it's going to be very sad if companies are so worried to comply with the notice requirement that they're overwhelmed and not being really able to contain the incident. Not all companies are Ubers that have a colossal amount of employees that can handle that. I think many of them are going to be smaller, and this is all going to be very new for them. So I'm hoping that we can get a little bit clarity there, maybe have a shorter format to notify, to comply with the deadline, and then the ability to complement the notice going forward. And now going back to the notification of data subjects, I do think that it can create a lot of stress on individuals when they are informed that their data was exposed. It doesn't matter if it's like data that will never cause them risk, people understandably get concerned. And I think in Brazil, we're going to start creating that mentality, especially this year that we've had the monstrous data breaches in the beginning of the year that affected all Brazilians. People are going to start to understand the true impact
of when their data is exposed, identity theft, fraud, etc. That's all going to happen. So I do think that for a data subject, for that notice to make sense and for it to not create an additional layer of hysteria, companies need to know a little bit better what happened so that they can structure it's two very different communications that need to be sent out. A technical one to the Data Protection Authority and a more humanized one to the data subject that can respond to their concerns. I hope that can also make them calm that the incident has been contained. Otherwise, it just creates a tsunami of questions and pushbacks, potential litigation, and that's not helpful for everyone. I know that in LATAM, there are very few countries that have already made this distinction of what needs to be reported to the data subject versus to the DPA. And I'm hoping that we can face this with the Brazilian Data Protection Authority. Otherwise, I think it's going to be very ugly. It is a very litigious country. So I think the reality of over notifying two data subjects in Brazil can have a bad impact in society as a whole with over level of complaints, super litigation, and also overwhelming the Data Protection Authority that is not largely staffed. And I don't think it will be able to reasonably navigate if there's a huge flow on reportings to it. So I think all this needs to be well thought through and potentially taking a lot of the learnings that we have from EMEA of over-reporting, under-reporting, and not reporting to data subjects, lack of transparency, all that needs to be taken into consideration for it to be done properly. The other thing that I wanted to add out is the difficulty on, I need to wrap up. Okay, so I just want to mention that I would really love if we could have a simplified format of reporting that has some consistency around the world so that companies don't need to reinvent the wheel every time there is an incident that impacts different countries, because that would make things a lot smoother. That's it.
Flavia, thank you so much for sharing with us all your experience. And I think you mentioned really important takeaways, especially from a pretty practical perspective. No doubt the last point you touched is really important in terms of having a certain consistency in the form that can be used for incident reporting, and the need to for the ANPD to understand and incorporate in its regulation the idea that it's one thing to inform the authority and it's another thing to inform the data subject, and the level of information and the timing of those two communications, they need to be different. And for the data subject, you really need to understand what happened, be able to say what you've done to prevent it from it to carry on and bring some peace of mind that is no longer a problem. For the ANPD, you really need to tell them, oh, it's happening and I'm working, and probably give more information in terms of all the mitigation factors that were actually implemented. And I think those are really important takeaways, especially for the director to keep in mind. And with that, I'd like to invite Marie Olson from Boeing to share her thoughts. I know Marie's having some problems with her video, but her audio should be okay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for organizing this workshop for the last 2 days, CIPL, and appreciate being invited, and I'm honored to serve on this knowledgeable panel with attendees in a variety of different types of business. So it's very interesting for me to also listen in. So let's go ahead and just jump into the next slide, since I know we're running a bit behind. I wanted to start in the top right-hand corner here to just mention that having an effective incident management process really needs to start well before you have a breach or an incident. your process needs to evolve and improve over time. So we use a continuous improvement model based on the Plan, Do, Check, Act model. I'll use that to describe our program. During our planning phase, we focus on prevention and minimizing impact. Prevention really includes implementation of an accountable privacy program like the ones you heard about yesterday. And as part of that accountable program, you'll be including controls that are designed to prevent incidents. You'll document your controls and your response processes, and you'll do training for staff so they'll know how to recognize when an incident occurs, how to report and who to report the incident to, as well as providing training and practice for your response team. Key point in this is that being able to quickly respond and to demonstrate that you have a comprehensive program of internal controls in place is really key in minimizing the impact to the data subjects, but also to your company following an incident or data breach. I'll illustrate this with a really quick story that really in the United States, we've had to comply with data breach regulations since 2003, when the state of California passed the first breach law. And at the time, our company did not have a privacy office. So our security department wrote a high-level procedure that included the need to respond to a data breach. And it had one line in the process that said, notify affected parties. Because in the US, the notification, at least in California, started with the need to notify the data subjects, but not the regulators. So it wasn't until a few years later when we had our first data breach, and it was a lost laptop that did not have all of its data encrypted. And unfortunately, in reviewing the backup of that laptop, we discovered that we had about 160,000 people's data on it and needed to notify them. So having one line that says notify affected parties isn't very helpful when you have to figure out how to do that. We had a second incident not too much later, and the number was even greater. It was about 400,000 people. So if you think about having to notify 400,000 people, and by then we had more laws in place, some requiring notification to regulators, and a lot of, once the notices go out, you have a lot of calls coming in. I think we logged about 16,000 calls on one of the days. Really coming up with your process and having that ready to go well before you have an incident is key. So part of that planning, I'll just kind of go over, you should document your process and also test your plan periodically so that more of your effort goes into that planning phase. During the do phase, that's when the incident occurs, and I'll talk about the life cycle on the next slide, but then you have a plan to follow. If your primary incident response person happens to be on vacation, you've practiced it with other members of the team, you can stay calm because you've got detailed instructions. Critical during this is also documenting your actions that you're taking during each phase, preserving evidence, et cetera, doing your resolution and restore, and then in the end, creating a report. But then equally important is the third phase, which is looking at your after incident review and analyzing your metrics. So a lot of times people think that metrics are just about how many incidents do you have, and as David mentioned earlier, and Bridget as well, that just because you have a lot of reported incidents isn't necessarily an indicator that you don't have a good program. In fact, it's usually the opposite. It means that even you have educated people, they can recognize when something goes wrong and they can report it and know how to report it, and they do it quickly so that you're able to respond in a timely fashion. Instead, what's more important about the metrics are what are the causes of the incidents? Are there particular groups that perhaps need more training? Do you have a new technical control that potentially you should implement? So taking the lost laptops back in the early 2000s that happened, initially we had only folder encryption on laptops. So that meant that people had to take a positive action to move their sensitive data into an encrypted folder. So following the loss of the laptops, we rolled out whole disk encryption for all laptops enterprise-wide. we also implemented two-factor authentication at the same time. And so, you know, coming up with your remediation plan during that check phase is important. And then that's when you do your act phase, which is updating your policies, making changes to your controls, et cetera, so that you can, the next time you have a similar incident, potentially it won't be reportable because now your laptop has whole disk encryption. Or better yet, we also rolled out comprehensive laptop training that talked about safe ways to transport your laptop if you're going between the home and office, like not leaving it in the front seat of your car, putting it out of sight, or better yet, locking it in your office and not traveling with it if you didn't have a need. And another thing that we did was implemented a checkout system for laptops for people on travel, so that instead of taking their laptop with all of their data, they could, in fact, get a laptop that just had limited data on it for a presentation or for and the ability to connect back. So if it was stolen, not much was lost. Okay, let's go to the next slide, and we won't spend a lot of time on this one, but it's just to show you the incident life cycle. And it starts off with planning again, and then your documentation should include how to receive an alert, where reports should go, who should be involved, and then very quickly your incident leader will assemble it. They'll triage the report that comes in, determine if it's a serious incident from the initial information, and then they'll pull together the right team. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But then the next phase sometimes happens linearly, but often it starts happening all at once, where you've got some people working on containment, some people starting the investigation, another part of your team is working on correction and recovery, and you might have to be doing some notifications or communications during this phase. If you have like the 72-hour reporting requirement, you may still be investigating, still be doing containment, but you have a notification requirement. So all of these might happen sort of simultaneously. But once your incident is complete, then really your process for managing isn't, you go to that lessons learned and metrics review, and then that feeds back into your policy and planning. So a few stats about this. I just, a few years ago, ran a tabletop exercise at a security conference. And at the end, we polled the audience to find out, you know, how mature programs were. And this was just a few years ago. And what we found is that while 58% of our audience, and it was a fairly well-attended seminar, had said that they had experienced a breach, we still had 6% of the audience that still had no response plan, and 27% that only had a really high-level plan, similar to the one that we started with in 2003. And only about a third of the audience said they ever tested their plan. So just, you know, some surprising statistics, even though data breaches have been reported so much in the news lately, that we still have areas where people aren't focusing on this.
Sorry, I think we need to wrap up. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Okay. No worries. If you just go to the next slide, I won't cover this, but it really just talks about what needs to be in the plan. And the only thing I want to highlight that maybe hasn't been covered is on communications. We focused on notifying the affected individuals and also the regulators, but you also need to develop your internal and external communications, what you say to the press and what you say internally inside your company as well, especially if it's an incident that involves employees. If you don't communicate about it, then you'll spend a lot of time answering calls from people to say, was I affected because my coworker got a notice and I didn't? So depending on the size, you may decide that you want to do some additional reporting.
Well, super. Thank you so much for your insights and your presentation. And I think one important takeaway is really like it's no good to just have a bunch of policies in place. They really need to be detailed and thought through so they can actually be effective when you have an incident, when you have a situation that needs to be addressed. Thank you very much. And now I will immediately pass on to Nicholas from Zoom, which has experienced a significant growth. And actually, thank you, Zoom, for enabling us to have such an amazing event, even if we are all at a safe distance from each other.
Thank you, Ana Paula. Good morning to everyone who's watching the conversation in English. Bom dia para quem está assistindo em português. For those of you who I haven't had the pleasure to meet yet, my name is Nicolas Andrade. I am the Director of Government Relations for Zoom here in Latin America. And before I move on to your question, Ana, I'd like to thank the Center for Information Policy Leadership and Centro de Direito Internet e Sociedade at IDP for their invitation. It's really an incredible conversation and a pleasure to be here to share our perspective from Zoom on this topic. So prior to talking about the work that Zoom has led in the security front, I'd like to begin by providing a little bit of important context. Zoom was founded 10 years ago in the United States, focusing on serving sophisticated business customers and enterprise customers, and it quickly stood out by producing a reliable product that was simple to use, and it deliberately made it as easy as possible for people to access meetings. And this all changed in 2020 with the COVID-19 pandemic. As people all over the globe sheltered in place to curb the spread of the virus, much of the world was suddenly working, studying, socializing from home, and our ease of use and ability to handle significant increased demand very quickly made it the platform of choice for millions of people around the world. To put this into perspective, we went from having 10 million daily participants in December 2019 to having over 300 million daily participants in April of 2020. So it's under this context that we took decisive steps to prevent or at least greatly minimize the risk of data breaches, a series of security measures that focused on our product, on our people, and on our programs. To begin with, I'll talk about the key product security improvements. In April 2020, we started a 90-day security plan, freezing development on most of our products and focusing all of our efforts on security on the platform. We acquired Keybase, which is a company focused on end-to-end encryption, and made the feature available for all Zoom accounts, including free accounts. Within the video communication space, we led in the enablement of features like randomized meeting IDs, passwords, waiting rooms, two-factor authentication, and also the addition of a new security button for all meeting hosts. This new button, which is on the bottom left of the host screen, allows hosts to remove an undesired participant, put someone on mute, control the screen sharing permissions, or even stop additional participants from joining the call, among others. Secondly, we've invested heavily in people. For example, we've hired a head of vulnerability management, a new head of detection and response, and significantly increased the size of our privacy product engineering team, as well as the technical security organization, which is the CISO org. In addition to that, we've more than doubled the size of our privacy team in 1 year. And we've reviewed our internal processes to ensure that all of these teams are working in an integrated way, right, within the company, which minimizes the risk of data breaches and at the same time prioritizes, of course, the safety and the security of our users. And thirdly, we've put in place programs that are designed to minimize the risk of data breaches. So we view privacy and security as being akin to maintaining good health, right, as an ongoing process that requires care and dedication and is never really complete. So in that light, we expanded and reinforced our bug bounty program. We now engage proactively with the security researcher community to help make the product more secure. And we even established an offensive security team that includes a dedicated red team internally whose purpose is to hunt for bugs. These important investments, I'd say, in security are what mean that today we have the trust of governments, we have the trust of companies and individuals who use Zoom to communicate almost every single day. I'd like to spend some time, Ana, and I'm conscious of the time, to talk about notification of DPAs concerning data breaches, focusing a little bit, of course, on Brazil. Firstly, we believe there should be a clearer distinction between the notification obligations of processors and those of controllers. An important point to remember is that Zoom is primarily a data processor. And we believe that it should be the responsibility of data controllers to report data breaches to DPAs, as well as notifying data subjects. In fact, in many cases, we would be violating our contractual obligations with our customers if, as data processors, we were to initiate that official data breach notification process. So instead, our obligation is to promptly notify our customer, which is the data controller, and provide our full cooperation throughout. Several advanced privacy legislations like GDPR offer this distinction, and we'd recommend that at least a similar strategy is followed with LGPD in Brazil. Secondly, we believe that allowing more time to notify data breaches would allow data controllers to provide more detailed reports. We've mentioned this before in this panel, but the current period of 48, 72 hours that is established or commonly understood is important, and it is important to notify authorities swiftly, but as other people here have mentioned, it's frequently not enough time to understand the true nature and the details of the data breach. So having additional time can allow for more accurate information for both data subjects and DPAs. And thirdly, we'd recommend that the form that's used to communicate data breaches is accessible to companies that do not have a fiscal identification number in Brazil. I'm conscious that the current solution used here in Brazil is a temporary solution and that a more permanent form is being developed. So we'd suggest that this future version does not require a mandatory CPF or CNPJ number, because this places an additional hurdle for companies that don't yet have a fiscal presence in Brazil, but want to report using the formal channels. And finally, Anna, we'd suggest that DPAs like the ANPD really consider those thresholds. Again, this has been mentioned before on what breaches should be notified within that 48, 72-hour timeframe. Mr. Stevens alluded to the fact that we're trying to create a sensible instrument of privacy protection. And he mentioned, as did others, the risk of receiving a volume of notifications that's perhaps unreasonably large to sort through manually, given the available resources, especially looking forward in the future. So Anna, because of time, I'd say I'll leave it at that. Of course, I place myself at your disposal as always for any additional questions or clarifications. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nico. It was you raised also some really important aspects, and I wanted to just stress two takeaways. One is the issue of trust. And in the end, the importance that actually working on the whole response around a data breach has in terms of building the trust that the whole industry and the company specifically have of consumers, of data subjects, and it's really the way we exist. I think that often we see the reaction that but it's not in the best interest of the company to address that, and that is a serious misconception. We really want to make sure that users are comfortable with the services, with what is being offered, and they keep coming back. And for that, you need to be responsible, you need to be accountable, you need to work on trust. And you also mentioned some very, it seems simple and bureaucratic, but really have a thought out way to build the form, and this reporting structure is absolutely essential for companies to be able to comply. I've had some honestly bizarre experiences in the telecommunication sectors where you really wanted companies sometimes to comply with regulatory obligations, but because of details on the way a certain form was developed and the need to put the CNPJ, which is the enrollment with tax authorities that a foreign entity doesn't have in Brazil, you just couldn't go ahead and actually comply with a legal or regulatory obligation. So it's a simple issue, but with really complex and complicated consequences. So I think it's an important comment that Director Joacil can take as well. And finally, I do apologize for going over the time a little bit, and we're almost there, but this panel is being so rich in terms of discussion, and I'd like to pass the floor now to our last speaker, Christine, to give us now an overview, I guess, of the convergence between the data protection and cybersecurity management in practice. Thank you, Christine.
Muito obrigada, Ana. Eu vou tentar ficar nos 5 minutos. E muito obrigada a todos pelo convite. Eu estou achando esse evento extremamente interessante. Eu acho que é uma discussão muito rica. E eu vi na participação de todo mundo muitas das aflições que eu sentia vendo essa discussão de incidentes, data breaches, e eu vejo que não é só uma percepção minha desse desafio das empresas, né? Eu acho que é total e geral. E eu queria começar até quando você fez o seu fechamento na primeira colocação, você até comentou a diferença de data breach e o incidente conforme definido na LGPD, né? E eu achei muito interessante porque de todas as coisas que eu já vi desafios, essa eu não estava no meu radar, que era algo que estava sendo, de certa forma, um problema, porque, não sei, para mim, como venho da área de gestão de incidentes, da área de tratamento de incidentes, um data breach, ele é um incidente que envolve a divulgação de dados sensíveis e confidenciais, que no fundo é a definição da LGPD, que diz que um incidente de segurança que possa acarretar risco ou dano relevante aos titulares. Eu diria até que a LGPD talvez seja um pouco mais ampla, porque como ela fala em causar risco, às vezes você pode ter incidentes que não envolvam dados sensíveis e que causem risco. Então, talvez realmente ali tenha algo que teria que ser colocado, né? E acho que coloquialmente no Brasil a gente está usando o termo vazamento de dados só quando você tem algo que está, por exemplo, grandes bases de dados com dados biográficos ou alguma coisa assim. Então, realmente acho que é um pouco o uso legal, o uso técnico e o uso coloquial desses termos que acaba gerando um pouco de confusão, né? Mas eu acho que é natural. E eu queria começar fazendo uma reflexão de que o conceito de gestão de incidentes, ele evoluiu com o tempo, mas o conceito de ter equipes que façam tratamento e gestão de incidentes tem mais de 30 anos, né? Os primeiros grupos foram criados em 1988, né, quando a gente não tinha nem internet comercial ainda, né? Eu trabalho no CERT-BR, que é um dos 2 CERTs de responsabilidade nacional que nós temos no Brasil, dos grupos de tratamento de incidentes de responsabilidade nacional no Brasil. O outro é o CETIR-GOV, do Gabinete de Segurança Institucional da Presidência da República, né? O CERT-BR vai completar 24 anos agora, 1º de junho. Quer dizer, a gente tem uma estrada grande aí de missão, não só de fazer gestão de incidentes, como de melhorar a segurança no país. E eu acho que uma das coisas que é uma dúvida constante das organizações é exatamente como que gestão de incidentes se encaixa com todo o resto, mas não é só com a parte de proteção de dados e só com DPOs, né? A gestão de incidentes, ela tem uma intersecção com segurança da informação, com gestão de risco, com programas para detecção de insider threats, e insider threats tem uma ligação muito grande com a parte de privacidade, porque você tem muito a questão de você poder ter funcionários que queiram abusar acesso a dados, queiram vender dados, você tem, nessa área, pode algumas coisas serem tratadas como gestão de incidentes. Então, no fundo, acho que a complexidade para as organizações é como colocar essas diferentes áreas que já existem em contato uma com as outras, como fazer esse tracking, né, como ter esses processos, né. Eu acho que a Mary Olsen, ela apresentou muito bem como que a Boeing faz esse processo de gestão de incidentes, né. Isso é uma coisa que eu particularmente estou ensinando o processo de gestão de incidentes desde 2003, né, a gente tem cursos aqui no Brasil dessa área, e a gente tem basicamente ensinado a lidar com data breaches desde essa época, porque quando você tem um processo de gestão de incidentes, né, chega uma certa hora de triagem, detecção, quando você confirma que esse incidente tem algo a mais que precisa ser feito, esse algo a mais pode ser porque você detectou que é um crime e eu preciso reportar a uma autoridade policial, ele pode ser um algo a mais que envolvia dados pessoais, então aí eu preciso fazer algo, quer dizer, por anos a gente dizia, olha, no Brasil não tem uma autoridade específica, mas você vai precisar ver se você precisa reportar para o titular, você tem que ver se tem algo jurídico, então as organizações já tinham isso no radar, e eu acho que o que a gente tem no momento
que eu vejo para as organizações é talvez integrar mais o conceito do DPO com o conceito de gestão de incidentes, porque a gente tem visto muitas organizações focando demais o papel do DPO na área jurídica e na área de compliance mesmo, de como eu trato os dados de maneira legítima e os que eu capturo, e talvez não se integrando tanto em qual é o momento e como esse DPO vai ficar nesse processo de gestão de incidentes. Uma coisa que a gente tem que ter em conta, e até tinha num dos Q&As ali falando, mas e as pequenas que não têm DPO, elas também não têm um grupo de tratamento de incidentes, né? E isso é uma coisa que a gente tem recomendado muito para as pequenas empresas, você precisa ter alguém que é o seu consultor de segurança ou de TI, ou de alguma coisa que entenda de tudo isso. E que essa, né, assim como está na própria lei, ela deixa claro que você pode ter um DPO externo, né? Muitas organizações vão ter que ter, talvez nessa mesma organização, olha, esse plano tem que envolver incidentes, esse plano vai ter que envolver algo, né? Então, eu acho que é muito complexo, mas eu até, para ir encerrando, só queria comentar que eu achei assim, muito ilustrativo o exemplo, né, que o Stevens deu de furto de um laptop que estava cifrado e que você já sai fazendo notificações, porque uma coisa que a gente colocou na nossa contribuição para a área de incidentes, a gente tem repassado para a NPD, que é um cuidado é não ter over notification, né? Esse é um problema, você pode inclusive tornar o trabalho da autoridade impossível de fazer se a rede do que tem que ser notificado for muito grande, porque aí você começa a ter muito incidente em que, sim, potencialmente poderia haver um impacto, mas não houve. Você tem aí muitas vezes a empresa com medo, não posso não notificar, então eu vou notificar qualquer coisa, e você começa a ter aí um trabalho que fica quase impossível de focar naqueles incidentes que são mais importantes para o cidadão, né? Então eu acho que essa parte toda é muito importante de tentar, não é que ninguém quer que se perca algo para a autoridade, né, e não é algo que não se queira, mas você tem que talvez fazer a autoridade trabalhar em conjunto com outros grupos de tratamento de incidentes, né? A gente tem conversado muito com a autoridade, inclusive sobre o nosso papel, a gente nem pode fazer isso legalmente, quer dizer, quando alguém reporta um incidente para nós temos confidencialidade, mas o nosso papel como alguém que vai orientar qual é o incidente que precisa ser notificado para a autoridade, esclarecer como isso vai ficar. Então, eu acho que era só para colocar algumas questões, né? Mas eu diria principalmente para as grandes empresas, vejam como está o grupo de tratamento de incidentes, se ele ainda não está bem estabelecido, estabeleçam, façam esse grupo de tratamento de incidentes se incorporar na comunidade nacional e global de tratamento de incidentes, porque essa é uma comunidade que conversa muito sobre como lidar com data breaches, que tem processos, que sabe como trocar informações relevantes para mitigar e fazer o incidente com menos impacto de uma maneira que não vai criar mais problemas. Então, eu acho que é pensar para as empresas que gestão de incidente é uma área em si só e elas precisam se incorporar na comunidade de tratamento de incidentes. E agradeço novamente a participação, esse painel foi muito bom. Obrigada.
Cristine, muito obrigada. Eu vou passar para o português para seguir na mesma língua e não enlouquecer os intérpretes. Você tocou num ponto que eu acho que conversa com uma questão que a Flávia tinha levantado, e eu acho que é um takeaway muito importante da tua fala, que é a questão que a implementação da LGPD hoje e o papel do DPA, ele tem sido, do DPO, ele tem sido muito focado na questão jurídica. Acho que até pela preocupação com o histórico que a gente tem de judicialização, né? Existe muita gente que faz, né, os paralelos da LGPD com o Código de Defesa do Consumidor e esse receio de uma judicialização muito grande, e acaba sendo muito centrado a figura do DPO e toda a estrutura no aspecto jurídico. Mas, sem dúvida nenhuma, acho que um dos grandes desafios e daí a dificuldade da cultura da proteção de dados, né, da disseminação dessa cultura, é entender que a proteção de dados é muito maior do que os aspectos só jurídicos, e os aspectos técnicos e de segurança da informação, eles são absolutamente essenciais. Não adianta a gente ter uma política lindamente escrita e, na prática, aquilo não ser implementado. comentado. Eu vou pedir desculpas a vocês e ao público para a gente pular a parte agora de perguntas para caminhar aqui para o final. A gente já estourou o prazo um pouquinho, mas queria convidar a Giovana e a Laura para entrarem e poderem encerrar aqui o nosso evento. Giovana já chegou.
Ana, muito obrigada. Laura, eu acho que você
deve... Giovana, eu não estou conseguindo... Malakai, can you please... I can't start my video.
Deixa eu tentar te ajudar aqui, mas deixa eu já ir falando também.
Agora acho que deu certo.
Perfeito.
Deu certo.
Obrigada, Ana. Eu acho que esse painel de agora foi incrível e, igualmente, os eventos que nós tivemos hoje. Eu acho que Laura queria falar umas palavrinhas antes e aí eu faço o fechamento do nosso evento, mas muito obrigada a todos os palestrantes. Realmente aprendi muito com todos vocês hoje. Mas, Laura, com você.
Excelente, obrigada, Giovana. Eu queria, em primeiro lugar, agradecer aqui a todos os palestrantes de hoje e de ontem, agradecer a fantástica moderação aqui, inclusive da Ana Bialer também, do Marcos Heider, foram moderações espetaculares. Eu queria fazer todo esse agradecimento também em nome do Danilo Doneda, um grande amigo e parceiro. Ele coordena e dirige o CEDIS junto comigo. Infelizmente, ele não pôde estar aqui, mas participou de toda a preparação para esse diálogo, para esse seminário. Então, todo esse agradecimento também é em nome do Danilo, em nome do CEDIS IDP. Dizer que é uma honra, Giovana, mais uma vez, continuar conduzindo, trabalhando com o CIPL nesse projeto. E talvez muito rapidamente falar que talvez os takeaways, né, que a Ana também já muito bem colocou, me parece que a gente começou de uma forma fantástica com 2 keynotes, tanto do Trevor Hughes, da IAPP, mostrando o papel do DPO, como esse papel foi mudando ao longo do tempo, como é importante, como há mesmo, ele falou déficit mesmo de uma atualização constante que é necessária, de uma função tão relevante. Então, mostrando como essa função hoje ela é determinante, e isso no Brasil, eu diria que vai ser, acima de tudo, um processo em que a gente vai ter que sempre se atualizar, e a importância do DPO como a figura que vai concretizar a lei dentro da empresa. Então, acho que isso foi muito interessante. Depois também tivemos mais um outro keynote espetacular do James Snook, mostrando como os dados são relevantes como um ativo fundamental, e mostrando uma visão, né, quase como uma terceira via, ou uma nova via, como a Boiana muito bem colocou, para pensarmos a proteção de dados pessoais. E, em seguida, tivemos 2 painéis espetaculares, eu diria também 2 grandes desafios da nossa LGPD. O primeiro, falando de transferência internacional de dados, mostrando a importância de termos mecanismos e certificações que possibilitem essa transferência, já que a natureza do dado é realmente fluir, né? Há uma necessidade de criarmos e viabilizarmos essa transferência. Isso certamente é um desafio na LGPD. E, então, terminamos com esse painel espetacular sobre incidentes de segurança, acho que com tantas visões importantes. Me parece que atingimos também aqui o objetivo de termos os diretores da NPD, diretores de autoridades estrangeiras, empresas também muito bem representadas. Acho que foi um diálogo de altíssimo nível. Fico muito contente de poder participar, inclusive, da organização desse diálogo. Agradeço mais uma vez aqui também, em nome do IDP, do CEDIS, do Danilo, agradecendo aqui, Giovana, também, e aí queria fazer uma palavra agradecendo e parabenizando aqui o seu trabalho, o trabalho da Isabela Rosal aqui também em frente ao CEDIS. A gente sabe que não é possível fazer um evento dessa magnitude, né, com tantos atores tão diversos do mundo inteiro, sem muito trabalho. Então, eu queria aqui parabenizar, dizer que o seu trabalho foi incrível ao longo desse tempo todo, e já, então, sem mais delongas, passar aqui a palavra para você. Muito obrigada a todos.
Obrigada, Laura. Igualmente, essa parceria eu acho que está cada vez mais incrível entre a CIPL e os CEDIS do IDP. Então, vamos fechar aqui muito rapidamente, porque não temos muito tempo. Esse foi o segundo diálogo global, né? Como a gente falou bem no iniciozinho, na primeira fala da Boiana, o primeiro diálogo global que a gente organizou antes mesmo desse projeto existir, foi lá em 2015. E o que eu estava pensando aqui é que esse evento foi tão interessante, tão relevante, que a gente não pode esperar mais 5, 6 anos para repeti-lo. Nós temos que fazer esse evento de novo, em menos tempo, e se tudo der certo, ao vivo no Brasil, no calor, porque eu e Bridget estamos aqui em Londres morrendo de frio, eu estou com cobertor no colo, porque estou com frio. Mas então, é isso, gente, muito obrigada. O nosso projeto ele vai continuar. Esse ano a gente continua com a programação, temos aí mais 2 séries de webinars e 4 papers para serem publicados. Vamos publicar também um relatório com um resumo desse diálogo global de ontem e hoje. E além disso, vamos continuar contribuindo para o trabalho da ANPD. Então, queria agradecer a todos os diretores por terem participado do nosso evento. A Nairane vai participar amanhã da mesa redonda de políticas públicas. A gente se mantém à disposição para continuar trabalhando com a ANPD, está no nosso planejamento continuar contribuindo para as consultas públicas e tomadas de subsídios. Então, com isso, agradecendo a todos os participantes que continuaram aqui firmes conosco até agora, e tenham todos um ótimo resto do seu dia. Muito obrigada.